We'll call this hearing to order, the first hearing of the 118th Congress for the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability. Welcome. As chairman, I intend to focus this committee's attention and resources on its core mission to ensure our government is working for the American people in an efficient manner. Agencies guard taxpayer funds from fraudsters and ineligible participants, and political leadership be held accountable for bad consequences of their policies. Last Congress, Democrats strayed far from this mission. The Biden administration faced little to no scrutiny under unchecked, one-party Democrat rule in Washington. This committee conducted almost no oversight of federal government agencies, programs, or policies. The nonpartisan Lugar Center gave Democrats an F in oversight last Congress. Instead, this committee spent its time and resources demonizing America's oil and gas industry, investigating an NFL football team, and examining pet, flea, and tick collars. The American people have suffered from the lack of oversight and accountability. Crises have continued and worsened. Our nation is facing the worst border crisis in American history. Fentanyl, which is coming across the southern border, is the leading cause of death for many Americans. Americans are facing high energy prices resulting from policies aimed at diminishing domestic energy production. And the American people have struggled with consequences of prolonged COVID closures and lockdowns, inflation, and shortages of labor and goods. That's why this first hearing is so important. Today's hearing is a first step in examining the massive waste, fraud, and abuse in COVID relief programs. In March of 2020, the United States struggled to respond to growing threats presented by COVID-19. With the economy on the brink of collapse, Congress passed a series of bills intended to both fund the public health response and keep the economy afloat. The largest of these measures was the bipartisan CARES Act. It created programs like the Paycheck Protection Program, which saved jobs at small businesses across the country. It rolled out pandemic unemployment insurance to help American workers who were victims of business closures and spiking unemployment. These programs brought relief to many Americans. But with massive government spending comes opportunity for waste, fraud, and abuse. Unfortunately, Democrats conducted little oversight of the over $2 trillion spent under the CARES Act. They did the exact opposite. They spent another $2 trillion, but this time with absolutely no protections or guardrails to prevent waste. And worse, they spent this money when there was no sign that it was actually needed. This out-of-control spending led to 40-year high inflation, kept people out of work longer, and harmed our economy. During the markup of this legislation, many of us warned that without oversight mechanisms in place, taxpayer dollars were at risk of being misused or lost to fraud, waste, or abuse. Republican amendments would have put strings attached on those dollars. They would have allowed for oversight. But Democrats voted down every single amendment we offered. And what happens if there's no oversight? Nothing good. We've seen reports that between $163 to $400 billion in unemployment insurance benefits were paid out improperly. We've seen reports that between $76 to more than $100 billion in Paycheck Protection Program and economic injury and disaster loan programs were lost to improper payments. We've seen reports that $266 billion in improper payments were made by Medicaid during the pandemic. That's why we're having our first hearing of the new Congress on waste, fraud, and abuse in pandemic spending programs. We will hold many more of these hearings on this important issue. We owe it to the American people to get to the bottom of the greatest theft of American taxpayer dollars in history. We must identify where this money went, how much ended up in the hands of fraudsters or ineligible participants, and what should be done to ensure that it never happens again. This committee will evaluate the hundreds of billions of dollars in grants and loans doled out for nearly every agency in the federal government to ensure those funds were appropriately used to respond to the pandemic and not wasted on ineligible payees or unrelated matters. We will investigate the $189 billion in elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds, money meant to help reopen schools and address learning loss. Instead, these funds were often used on unrelated expenditures and even to push divisive ideologies onto our students. We will work to ensure that the watchdogs in our offices of inspectors general and our law enforcement officers, agents, and prosecutors have the tools they need to track down fraudsters and recover illegally obtained COVID-19 taxpayer funds. This committee has for too long stood on the sidelines while taxpayer dollars were wasted by bureaucrats whose only priority is getting money out the door. Today, we will hear from Inspector General Michael Horowitz, GAO's Comptroller General Jean Dodaro, and Assistant Director David Smith with the Office of Investigations at the Secret Service. Thank you all for being here to testify about your efforts to conduct oversight of pandemic funding. I now yield to Ranking Member Raskin for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you kindly. Our committee's purpose is to ensure that government is effectively delivering on its promises to the American people. And as the new ranking member, I'm eager to work with you and the rest of the committee in carrying out this shared responsibility in a thorough, serious, nonpartisan, and even-handed way. When I heard that our first hearing would spotlight pandemic relief programs, I was pleased because I thought it would follow up on everything the Democratic majority had been doing in the 117th Congress since COVID-19 began. I was hopeful for an opportunity to consider together how we can identify schemes of fraud and self-enrichment, ripping off the taxpayers, and continue to strengthen the structural efficiency of critical government programs that help families and businesses across America meet the challenges of the pandemic. Just as the political system and the campaign finance system have recently been proven shockingly vulnerable to imposters, hustlers, con men, big liars, outright fraudsters, and fakes, some of the programs developed to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic have proven vulnerable to the relentless, deceitful, and fraudulent designs of criminal predators when they too decide to exploit the generosity of the American people. The traditional language of waste, fraud, and abuse does not quite capture the confidence games and organized criminal artifices and schemes that have targeted and exploited relief programs built on the solidarity and goodwill of the American people. The House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus, which was chaired in the last Congress by then Majority Whip Clyburn, in which I served on, led the effort to identify and combat these criminal actors. The subcommittee conducted no fewer than 7 hearings focused on rooting out fraud in relief programs. I will never forget how under Chairman Clyburn's leadership, in our first week or two of existence, the subcommittee recovered an improper $10 million Paycheck Protection Program loan. Less than 3 months later, we helped secure the return of $109 million from a nursing home chain that was not using the loan as Congress had specifically intended. In March of 2021, we exposed how the Trump administration's reckless mismanagement of small business relief programs and refusal to implement basic anti-fraud controls led to nearly $84 billion in fraudulent loans. Just months later, we issued another report highlighting how the Trump administration awarded $95.7 million in pandemic food box program funds to 3 companies that all raised severe red flags. Then again, in April of 2022, we showed how Trump White House officials overruled career Department of Defense officials to approve a $700 million national security loan to a single company in violation of legal requirements, and so on. We used the spotlight and bully pulpit of a small subcommittee to expose and reverse colossal frauds taking place against the American people. While I remain optimistic that this hearing can meaningfully explore ways to ensure that taxpayer dollars go where intended, I confess I'm troubled that some of our colleagues seem to want to cherry-pick facts and deploy distorted figures to attack the underlying legitimacy of the programs themselves, the programs that were a lifeline and salvation for millions of businesses and families across the country. Recall that while the former president denied, trivialized, and dismissed the COVID-19 pandemic, it was Congress which acted responsibly and swiftly and in bipartisan fashion to create and supercharge programs that saved countless businesses and families from bankruptcy and ruin. These programs included expanded unemployment insurance benefits and the PPP program, which empowered families and businesses to avoid economic collapse. As a result of our actions, the COVID-19 economic recession was the shortest on record. The programs were by no means perfect. Antique government IT systems, many running on obsolete software, collapsed and were incapable of adapting to the scope of the crisis. States entered the pandemic at a 50-year low for unemployment insurance system funding, and UI claims burgeoned from 211,000 to 6.6 million, a 3,000% increase over a three-week period in March of 2020. People unsure of how they would pay their housing or medical bills panicked as they waited hours on phone calls for customer service representatives or reached endless busy signals in unemployment insurance purgatory. My home state of Maryland was no exception. In the one-year period from March 2020 until March 2021, my district office received 1,400 anguished constituent requests for help with unemployment. This is in contrast to one constituent request we received in all of 2019. Congress asked agencies and states to do the near impossible, and they did their very best. Expanded UI benefits kept an estimated 5 to 6 million people out of poverty in 2020 and 6.7 million people above the poverty line in 2021. The Center for Budget and Policy Priorities estimates that expanded benefits may have saved the lives of as many as 27,000 people in high-risk occupations who may have died from COVID had they not had access to benefits. Organized criminals and fraudsters took advantage of these circumstances by exploiting weaknesses in our IT systems. This problem was compounded by critical decisions made by the Trump administration that hamstrung pandemic relief anti-corruption oversight from the very outset, crippling the government's ability to detect fraud. Despite specific legislative instruction from Congress in our pandemic relief bills, the Trump administration regularly told agencies to ignore data reporting requirements. But congressional Democrats and the Biden administration have worked diligently from the start to recover funds stolen by organized criminal groups and other fraudsters, help states modernize their IT systems, and build new structural capacities to detect and prevent fraud. Under President Biden's leadership, departments and agencies across the government moved swiftly to strengthen program integrity and bolster efforts to prevent, detect, and pursue fraud, which festered under the lackadaisical stewardship of the prior administration. In the days preceding this hearing, Republicans have claimed that Democrats on this committee and in the Biden administration neglected to conduct meaningful oversight of these programs. The record demonstrates these assertions are baseless. Democrats have systematically ferreted out fraud, waste, and abuse in pandemic relief, although we all can certainly be doing a much more effective job, and that's what this hearing should be about. As the work of the 118th Congress commences, I urge all of my colleagues across the aisle and on our side to remember the crucial role this committee must play in eliminating fraudulent schemes by imposters in order to protect the integrity of the programs that we adopt and that America needs. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to yield back.
Ranking member yields back. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our panel. I'll go through and introduce each member, and then we'll turn it over to begin their opening statements. But let me say this. This is a pretty quality panel. I think if you wanted to have the perfect hearing to determine waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government, I can't think of three better witnesses from three more appropriate agencies to come before this committee. And I think you'll see this is going to begin a trend of having credible witnesses that are here to talk about serious, substantive issues. And I'm very proud of this witness panel today. Our first witness today is Mr. Dodaro, the 8th Comptroller General of the United States and head of the U.S. Government Accountability Office, or GAO. In a career spanning over 49 years at GAO, Mr. Dodaro has worn many hats and testified before Congress dozens of times on important national issues, including waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement in the nation's response to the coronavirus pandemic. Mr. Dodaro's extensive experience at the helm of an agency often referred to as the congressional watchdog is invaluable. We're glad to have you here for this very important oversight topic, and we look forward to your testimony. Our second witness, no stranger to Congress, is Mr. Michael Horowitz, who is the chair of the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, or PRAC, and Inspector General of the Department of Justice. Mr. Horowitz is testifying today in his role as chair of PRAC, an entity created by the CARES Act to support independent oversight of pandemic relief spending. The PRAC coordinates cross-agency investigations by agency inspectors general, enabling faster identification of fraudsters across multiple programs. This is a very important role. Mr. Horowitz and the committee looks forward to learning more about your and your colleagues' efforts to detect fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement of taxpayer dollars. And our third witness is Mr. David Smith, Assistant Director, Office of Investigations at the U.S. Secret Service. As the 28th Assistant Director for the Office of Investigations, Mr. Smith leads the agency's global investigative mission, comprising 161 offices and over 3,000 employees. Mr. Smith's office also oversees the Secret Service's National Pandemic Fraud Investigations and cross-agency coordinated efforts, including investigations of foreign nationals stealing COVID relief funds. I look forward to hearing about the agency's investigations into pandemic relief, fraud, and ongoing efforts to counter such activities. Welcome, Mr. Smith, and we'll begin with Mr. Dodaro. And I hope I pronounced that right. I apologize if I didn't.
Was excellent, Mr. Chairman. Very good. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Raskin, members of the committee. I'm very pleased to be here. I commend you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and I'm very pleased to see the attendance. I'd like to focus my comments this morning on 4 points that I believe were the main causes of the widespread fraud that has occurred and what could be done to deal with these issues. First, agencies should have been much better prepared in order to prevent fraud in the first place. We worked with the Congress back in 2016, and the Congress passed the Fraud Reduction and Data Analytics Act, which required agencies to implement GAO's fraud risk framework to help prevent fraud in the first place. Agencies were slow to implement this legislation and therefore were not prepared properly when the coronavirus emergency occurred. This needs greater attention and oversight, I believe, from this committee. Secondly, the urgency in providing relief funds led to trade-offs that limited the ability to achieve accountability and transparency goals of the legislation. These trade-offs included allowing self-certifications and applications, limiting the amount of supporting documentation that applicants had to apply, and these trade-offs, along with internal control weaknesses within the agencies, made these programs much more susceptible to fraud than otherwise would have been the case. Now, Congress rectified some of these trade-offs in subsequent legislation. Agencies have begun to implement our recommendations, but there's much more that needs to be done to deal with the remaining COVID programs, to catch people who have perpetrated fraud and bring them to justice. But we're also, unless we make these changes, we're not better prepared for the future, for future emergencies, which certainly will come with disaster assistance and relief and other events that are unforeseen, but certainly will come. Third, I'm advocating, and I've done this before, that there's a permanent center for excellence and analytics in the Inspector General community. Now, this first one was created back in the Recovery Act when we had the Great Recession, and that Recovery Operations Center helped prevent fraud and enable the IGs to work together because a lot of the fraudsters hit multiple programs as well, and this brought in great data analytics experience. Unfortunately, this center was terminated in 2015. Now, I recommended Treasury had the ability to pick up the center operations. They declined on that. I recommended the Congress to make it permanent at that point in time. I was not successful. I'm at it again, and I think it makes sense to have this to deal with. Fraud occurs in regular federal programs all the time, as well as improper payments, which we talk about in our statement. And if you had this permanent capability, it would not only deal with regular fraud, but it would be ready and there when emergencies occur, and you won't waste time standing up. Every day wasted is another day susceptible to fraud and improper payments. This would help. Fourth, the government has an underlying improper payment problem. These are payments that shouldn't have been made or were made in the wrong amounts. You know, I've testified before this committee many, many times on this problem over the years. It occurs in a wide range of federal programs. It's pervasive across the government. So when you have that type of problem that we're not dealing with on a regular basis, and you add additional spending of billions, hundreds of billions, in this case trillions of dollars, you're going to have these type of problems in place. So I have many recommendations in my testimony that I think would help address this issue. And I've put forth at least 10 legislative suggestions for how Congress can act to make sure that this problem doesn't happen again at the magnitude in which we've seen in this particular case. So I'm looking forward to answering questions today. I'm also looking forward to working with this committee to put solutions in place that can guarantee when
before money went out the door. Model and institutionalizing it. Finally, let me touch on 3 PRAC legislative priorities. First, we hope Congress will take up legislation to make permanent the PRAC's data analytics platform. Taxpayers need that sophisticated tool to continue to exist, and I appreciate the Comptroller General's continued support for that. Second, Congress should consider raising the jurisdictional amount in the Program Fraud Civil Remedies Act from $150,000 to $1 million so IGs can more effectively pursue smaller dollar frauds. Finally, Congress should consider extending from 5 to 10 years the statute of limitations for pandemic unemployment insurance fraud, as it did last year with PPP and EIDL fraud. The PRAC and the IG community is committed to using all of the tools we've been provided, criminal, civil, and administrative, to pursue for the taxpayers every dollar that fraudsters stole from pandemic programs. Thank you for your continued support for those efforts, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Horowitz. Mr. Smith.
Good morning, Chairman Comer, Ranking Member Raskin, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today and discuss the ongoing efforts of the U.S. Secret Service to counter pandemic-related fraud. As the chairman mentioned, I serve as the Assistant Director for the Secret Service Office of Investigations, overseeing our 161 offices. I also oversee our 42 cyber fraud task forces that are central to our criminal investigations. I also direct our National Computer Forensics Institute in Hoover, Alabama, which trains and equips local law enforcement, as well as prosecutors and judges. I thank you all for your recent support of our institute and reauthorizing it. For more than 150 years, the Secret Service has conducted criminal investigations to protect the American public and financial infrastructure from criminal exploitation. We continue to do so while also fulfilling our protective duties. After 21 years in federal law enforcement, exploitation of government programs by criminals is not new to me. I often say the pandemic didn't create any new criminals, it just provided more opportunities for them to exploit. Countering pandemic-related fraud has been our investigative priority since March of 2020. In less than 3 years, we've opened thousands of investigations, recovered over $1 billion, arrested nearly 500 criminals, yet there is more work to do. It is our duty to detect and arrest criminals, seize their illicit assets, and disrupt their networks. Our experience in combating pandemic-related fraud reaffirms our investigative strategy. We continue to evolve our application of technology and training to develop skilled investigators who can in turn combat emerging criminal tactics. We recognize the potential for fraud based on our experience following major disasters. Prior to the CARES Act enactment back in March of 2020, we reached out to some natural partners to include the offices of the Inspector General for the Small Business Administration, the Department of Labor, and the Council of the Inspector Generals on Integrity and Efficiency. We understood that many key partners had limited resources, and the best way to address the potential wave of fraud was to work together. We also worked with our long-standing partners in fighting financial crimes at the Department of Justice, including U.S. attorneys' offices around the country, the Department of Treasury, FinCEN, and many others. The Secret Service has seen the full spectrum of pandemic-related fraud. This included N95 mask schemes, ransomware attacks targeting hospitals, the wide use of stolen identities, and inmates applying for benefits. Numerous cases also involved insiders with access to personal data. Criminals were prepared to exploit the pandemic, in part because for years they were selling identities stolen from past data breaches. They were also fabricating identities using personal and financial data of real people combined with false information. Our investigations also reveal that criminals use shell companies and false employment information. These tactics were repurposed for broad use during the pandemic. In closing, I'll share some observations from our pandemic-related fraud investigative experience. The prevalence of identity theft and the volume of personal data accessible to criminals is undeniable. Continuing to improve identity verification standards for government funding programs is important. Advanced collaboration, as some of my colleagues mentioned earlier, between government entities and the financial sector is essential for mitigating fraud targeting government programs, especially during emergencies. Ensuring law enforcement are at the table would be a major step in curtailing fraud of this magnitude as well. Our cyber fraud task forces are a proven model for such collaboration. In these task forces, and similarly in our protective mission, we constantly communicate the importance of sharing information and planning for contingencies. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I'm honored to represent the dedicated men and women of the Secret Service. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Before we get to the questions, I'm going to ask if you'll stand and take the oath here. Do you all, raise your right hands, do you all swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect the witnesses have all answered in the affirmative, and we want to thank you. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. And before we move into the question portion, we have a lot of new members, a lot of freshmen that have never served in any committee in Congress, and I just wanted to make sure everyone knows the rules here. We will rotate back and forth 5 minutes. Please adhere to the 5 minutes. We're going to try to be strictly by the book. The order is determined by myself and Ranking Member Raskins. Please be respectful of everyone's 5 minutes. I was telling some of the freshmen that during the 2017 session, my first full year in Congress, I was the very last person, dead last in seniority in the very far corner. And you appreciate when people don't go over their time, but this is your time. This is your time to ask anything you want. So please, to both sides, let's be respectful of each member's 5 minutes. And with that, I will begin questioning, and we'll start with Mr. Horowitz. You mentioned the do not pay list. Can you briefly tell us what that is?
Yeah, so Treasury has set up a list of suspicious payees. That doesn't mean they're not eligible, doesn't mean they can't get benefits. It means that they're on a list that requires at a minimum, secondary screening, secondary consideration and evaluation.
Was this used by government agencies to prevent fraud? So this is a tool that I would assume would have been eligible in their toolbox. Correct. Let's say the Small Business Administration or some agency that was doling out a lot of money really quickly. Did they utilize the do not pay list?
They did not, and the issue there is we've heard over and over again at the time, well, we needed to get the money out right away, there was an emergency. No dispute about that. We needed to get the money out right away, there was an emergency. It gets back to what the Comptroller General said, you need to be ready for that. this list was sitting there. This was not anything that would have taken much time. There needs to be preparation.
So let me get this straight. The do not pay list, I would assume that would be people that owe back taxes, people that maybe owe child support,
There are a variety of reasons.
convicted of fraud.
Indicative of potential fraud, indicative of individuals who are in arrears in other payments. You can get on the list for a variety of reasons.
So how many people do we know received money from the federal government that were on the do not pay list?
I don't know across all programs. What I do know is from the SBA's PPP program, because almost $400 billion went out in 2 weeks in that program. Of that amount, 57,000, 3.6 billion shouldn't have gone out right away. Not saying every one of those would have been denied, but at a minimum, there should have been secondary screening.
So what would be involved? What would this SBA had to have done if we could go back in time to ensure that people on the do not pay list were flagged at least for further review?
Well, frankly, interacting with the Treasury Department in advance to make sure that that screening was occurring, that data matching was occurring.
Yeah, unbelievable. Mr. Dodaro, by the end of 2020, Congress had already passed 5 laws containing more than $3 trillion in COVID relief funds. More than $1 trillion had been flagged by GAO as at risk for waste, fraud, and abuse. Inspectors general and law enforcement officials were already highlighting concerns about COVID relief money flowing to criminals and other ineligible recipients instead of Americans in need. And the economy was improving. Nevertheless, Democrats insisted on $1.9 trillion more COVID relief spending through the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, putting those funds at risk in theft and the economy at risk of massive inflation and recession. So, sir, did we lose funds included in the American Rescue Plan to fraud, and were additional improper payments made at the ARP after the ARP was passed?
Yes, I mean, the improper payments estimate, for example, for 2022 was the first year that the Paycheck Protection Program and the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program made improper payment estimates. That was about $29 billion for PPP and about $7 billion, over $6 billion for the EIDL program. We had urged that those improper payments be made earlier in 2021, but they didn't make those estimates then.
You encourage Congress to do that?
No, the agencies. We made recommendations.
What could Congress have done to have prevented this?
As one of my legislative recommendations from GAO is that any new programs over $100 million, not billion, $100 million, be designated immediately because of this past problem to be susceptible to improper payments, and therefore make an estimate in the very first year of the program. Right now, the improper payments estimates only have to be made 2 or 3 years after a program's already started. Wow. It's too late. It's too late. And some of these temporary programs, they're all done. Wow. And so Congress can and should have that as a requirement to be put in place.
Well, hopefully that'll be some kind of bipartisan legislative fix from this committee very soon. Mr. Horowitz, same question. I've got 40 seconds. What warning signs were there and what should have been done?
There were plenty of warning signs. Frankly, the urgency and speed to get it out without any consideration of what was already available to use, like do not pay, as we did in our fraud alert this week. Had there been agreements in place, they could have checked against Social Security Administration. I think it's very important that consent-based verification tools be put in place for programs. You need to know whether the applicant's eligible. You can't just self-certify, and they were relying on self-certification.
Wow, thank you. I'm sure we'll have many discussions moving forward, but my time has expired, and I yield to the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Raskins, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you much. Mr. Horowitz, following up on that, when did the SBA start using the Do Not Pay program to check the eligibility of applicants for PPP loans?
Following recommendations by SBA, OIG, the PRAC, and GAO, they started in 2021.
In January 2021, at the beginning of the Biden administration?
They said they were. It actually, I'm not sure it exactly started then. I mean, one of the issues has been getting them to implement what they said, but they did make efforts to start, and they did subsequently start doing that.
Great. Well, when we passed the CARES Act in 2020 and we created the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, which you lead, the CARES Act included specific language directing the PRAC to create a user-friendly website to give the American people an overview of how pandemic relief funds were being spent, all the way down to the project community level. But guidance released on April 10, 2020, by President Trump made it nearly impossible to effectively track pandemic relief funding past the first distribution. And Mr. Chairman, I want to ask unanimous consent to insert the administration's April 10, 2020 guidance into the record.
Without objection.
So, Mr. Horowitz, how did this guidance affect the PRAC's ability to identify and prevent pandemic relief fraud?
So in the CARES Act, Congress said that the PRAC needed to launch a website within 30 days. We did. Go to pandemicoversight.gov. You can see how the money has been spent. You can get to your local zip code if you'd like. We were challenged at the outset because OMB leadership decided to use what was already existing reporting tools in usaspending.gov, which we did not believe was sufficient. GAO did not believe was sufficient, and SBA and others, IGs, didn't believe was sufficient to meet the requirements of the CARES Act. The memorandum that went out that you mentioned put that in place, and it limited our ability at the outset to get the data we needed. For folks who followed our website from 2020 forward, you will see gradual additions to the website. Indeed, SBA wouldn't give us the information, this is an SBA agency issue, until September or October of 2020. We couldn't get much of any data from them because they were litigating FOIA lawsuits.
Gotcha. So do you think that that guidance met the language and the spirit of the CARES Act requirements for tracking pandemic relief spending all the way to the ground?
The public should know where money went. Congress needs to know where money went. You can't figure out whether a policy worked, whether it's been defrauded, who's accountable, if you don't know where the money went.
Mr. Dodaro, following the 2008 financial crisis, President Obama signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act to stimulate the economy and to get us out of the Great Recession. I think that was a $787 billion program, if memory serves. Do you think that that Trump administration 2020 guidance we're talking about effectively incorporated lessons that were learned from Obama's successful implementation of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act?
Not to the full extent that they should have been. The Recovery Act reporting required reporting from recipients, and the Recovery Act Board created that. So you had much more timely reporting than what you had under the guidance that Mr. Horowitz just talked about, which is using usaspending.gov. So, you know, they could have taken and some of those lessons, I think, so.
Gotcha. So, well, Mr. Horowitz, then, did you at all express your frustration with this undermining of the CARES Act determination that the public have complete accountability and transparency?
At the time we were meeting with, PRAC leadership was meeting with OMB and expressing the need to have better reporting portals than what existed with USA Spending. There are many issues with USA Spending. IGs have written about those that need to be fixed. GAO has written report after report about that. Those need to be fixed. If you want to find the best information that's out there, it's actually for the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which was the $150 billion in the CARES Act that went to the states. The reason that's there, that information there, is because the Treasury IG, working with the PRAC, created the recipient reporting portal. We couldn't do that. It cost us money. They cost them money. We couldn't do that for, you know, trillions of dollars. But that's what needs to be done.
Well, I'm proud that we included those provisions in the CARES Act precisely to ferret out fraud, to try to prevent the waste and abuse. But it obviously requires leadership at the presidential level, at the very top, a commitment to making sure that everything is accountable and transparent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Gosar for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good seeing you, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to see you this morning. You bring up mandated regular reporting aspects as a big key. And Congress has dictated a lot to you, but Congress hasn't done their fair share either. So when you look at the National Emergencies Act, there's a requirement that the Congress meet every 6 months to have a detailed report. Instead of synopsizing this all over a year or a year and a half, it would be better to have these numbers on a basis every 6 months, having accountability. Would you agree with me, Mr. Horowitz?
Yes, I think more regular reporting would be helpful, and part of that is getting the data, information from agencies to the public, to Congress in a timely fashion.
Yeah. So, would you agree with that, Mr. Dodaro?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And it's part of our the National Emergencies Act that actually Congress shall convene to look at these expenditures and to have some rein over it. And I think that's part of our purview is the power of the purse. And so if you're not having accountability to this body, to this Congress, you're lacking in your jurisdiction of oversight. So I guess having said that, looking at what we have seen in this gobbledygook of national emergencies that date back, that are open to the 1970s, I don't know how you figure these numbers out. I mean, it's crazy. I just don't know how this works. So my question is to the American taxpayer, there's estimates of $560 billion of fraud in the COVID-19 funds. Do you agree with that, Mr. Dodaro?
It will be a while before the full extent of fraud is known.
Right.
As I mentioned in my statement, there's been over 1,000 people have pled guilty or been convicted. There's over 600 charges still pending against people. The SBAIG has 536 active investigations right now. The Department of Labor IG is opening up 100 new cases every week. So this is going to go on for a while. There are definitely indications of widespread fraud, but it's impossible to estimate right now what the full extent will be. Time will have to unfold, and these investigations will have to be undertaken, because the definition of fraud is willful misrepresentation to get something of value that's adjudicated through a court or some other judicial process.
Would you agree that a continual reporting would be better? A timely reporting to the jurisdictional committee like this one, or transportation, in regards to the amount of fraud, the numbers of fraud. What can Congress do to allocate? More streamlining those processes. Do you see a process that we can go forward with that?
Yes, I mean, there's a regular process for the inspector generals to report semi-annually, but when you have extraordinary circumstances like we have, there could be more frequent reporting in those cases. But there's definitely benefits of having more frequent interaction and oversight by Congress with oversight bodies, the GAO and the inspector generals, in this case the Secret Service, because some of these legislative solutions that I've recommended could have been taken a lot earlier in the process.
And so if we're rewriting the National Emergencies Act, would you be able to give us your inferences as to how to detail the changes?
I'd be happy to look at the act and make suggestions.
Okay.
Yes.
How about you, Mr. Horowitz? I mean, you always come up with great ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. Be happy to.
To Mr. Smith, do you see any aspects of, particularly from the Secret Service, where we can make some amends within the National Emergency Act?
Thank you for the question, sir. As I mentioned in my opening, similar to our protective mission, which our brand is largely associated with, one of the central tenets of our mission is advance work. And as some of the co-panelists spoke about earlier, our cyber fraud task forces are a task force incorporating private sector, incorporating academia, and what we do is share information on a continual basis. So we don't wait until the president shows up in a district to establish relationships. We do that prior to that time. So similarly, in our investigative mission, we know that it's important to maintain relationships with financial institutions, academia, in order to get in front of fraud and share ideas, because we have a constant cadence of interacting with bad guys in the context of our jobs.
Thank you. I might run out of time. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Lynch for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member for holding this hearing, and I want to thank our panelists for your good work. I recognize you from previous hearings, and thank you again. This was a difficult challenge from the very beginning, and I just want to take us back to the Trump administration's initial response. So back in 2019 and 2020, you know, Mr. Trump on January 24th, 2020, the day the second coronavirus case was confirmed in the United States, President Trump tweeted and again reiterated that, quote, "China's been working very hard to contain the coronavirus. It will all work out. I want to thank President Xi." And then went on to say that the coronavirus would be over by Easter. Based on what we know now, did those statements by the President of the United States induce the sense of urgency that the American people should have harbored with respect to this pandemic, Mr. Dodaro?
I think that the actions that the Congress take showed the sense of urgency in passing the CARES Act back in March 2020 on a bipartisan basis. And I think that sent the right signal and the sense of urgency that needed to be addressed to those issues.
You're exceedingly diplomatic as always.
That's
Mr.
why I'm
Horowitz.
still here.
Mr. Horowitz, and Mr. Smith, you want to take a crack at that question?
Not particularly.
Well, let me just say that let me just get down into the details a little bit here. Unless Mr. Smith, you'd like to add, no? Okay. I'm not sure of the division of labor within your agencies, but are any of you familiar with the Yellow Corporation during your investigations? No.
Sorry, which corporation?
Yellow Corporation. It was a trucking company, apparently, with political connections to the Trump administration. Are you familiar with that?
I think that's the one that there was a loan given to out of one of the programs, and I think we
Correct.
we
Let me refresh. Let me try to
we
refresh.
looked at that issue.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
Let
we
me
looked
just-
at that.
All right, thank you. Let me try to refresh your recollection. So, the Select Committee, Subcommittee report confirmed that a $700 million loan to this trucking company that was politically connected to the Trump administration was given this $700 million loan, and Trump administration political appointees overruled Defense Department officials in that case to actually certify the company as a, quote, critical to maintaining national security, and therefore eligible for the loan. The company then went on to use the loan for long-term capital investments in violation of the CARES Act requirement. I was just curious if, I know you're familiar with it, do you have anything else you could add to that fact pattern?
I'd be happy to provide our results for the record. I can't remember offhand, and I don't want to misstate.
Okay, all right. Well, we could take that at a later time. What are the lessons learned based on how the Trump administration responded initially to the pandemic?
Number one, I think there should have been more preparedness on the part of the agencies to prevent fraud. You know, Congress passed legislation in 2016 based on GAO's advice on how to prevent fraud in the first place. Part of this is there's a cultural problem. In most cases, the fraud issues, people think of the inspector generals and think of the Secret Service and GAO, but you got to prevent it in the first place. But the agencies were slow to implement it.
Yeah.
The OMB was supposed to create a working group to develop this. We issued a report in 2019, said the working group had never met and they needed to take more actions, number one. Number two, I think the other lesson learned for the Congress is to be careful about putting provisions in the legislation that make programs more susceptible to fraud, allowing, for example, the self-certifications, not using tax transcripts for others. So I think there's legislation there as well. Thirdly, the agencies that had not addressed improper payment problems. So they knew they had payment problems, and not addressing open GAO and IG recommendations make them less prepared. So there's a lot of lessons, and my legislative solutions to these address some of these lessons learned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time has expired, and I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Dr. Fox for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I thank you for holding the hearing. I will have no questions for Mr. Dodaro, but I do want to thank him so much for the work he and his team do on behalf of the American people in helping us figure out ways to be more efficient and find the waste, fraud, and abuse. And I appreciate your comments just now. Since coming to Congress, I've fought for transparency and accountability in federal spending. And with trillions of dollars of COVID aid spent over such a short period of time, it's imperative we closely watch where and how that money was spent. And I think you've given us some more ideas. It's likely something we're going to have to track for a long time. But Mr. Horowitz, I have questions for you. Can you speak to the need for the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, or PRAC, is and its importance?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think it was critical for Congress to have set up the PRAC when the CARES Act was passed. At the time, we were asked to oversee $2 trillion. It's now $5 trillion of pandemic oversight. And what it did was it brought the Inspector General community together to coordinate oversight. We created a data analytics platform to do the kind of work that resulted in our fraud alert last week. And you gave us hiring authority to bring on great data scientists, great team that has enabled us to do this work. We got it up and running, and we moved forward. And as a result, we've been able to coordinate more closely with not only our IG partners, but with the GAO and with state and local auditors. We created a state auditor in residence program. We have 2 auditors from the state of Tennessee who've come on board recently. First ever that's been done in the IG community, because we want to coordinate with our counterparts and our oversight partners at the state and local level. And so we've brought together people in a way that we've never had before in the IG community.
So in your work, how would you rate, with the PRAC, how would you rate the various COVID relief funding programs from most to least susceptible to improper payments?
Well, I think what you've seen so far is the three of the biggest programs: the Paycheck Protection Paycheck Protection Program, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, and the Unemployment Insurance Program. Those 3 programs, which by the way account for just under $2 trillion of the spending, have shown to be highly susceptible to fraud for different reasons. PPP.
Can you give us the characteristics that cause that?
Yes. So for PPP and EIDL, those were administered at the federal level. And the problem there was the desire to simply get the money out as quickly as possible without taking not an unreasonable amount of time, but an appropriate amount of time to make sure that they were sending the money to the right people. That was the problem, among others, with those 2 programs. On the unemployment insurance, the issue is different because that's administered by the 50 states. The problem there is the lack of coordination among them and with the Labor Department, and the Labor IG has written extensively about that problem.
So we have some recommendations on what to do in that area.
A number of recommendations,
Good.
And I'd be happy to send them up to you.
Absolutely. Since the Labor Department's in the jurisdiction of the Education and Workforce Committee, I'm anxious to see those. So you charged 47 defendants in a $250 million fraud scheme involving a Minnesota nonprofit, Feeding Our Future, one of the largest COVID aid-related frauds uncovered. What, if any, indicators were there of this sort of fraud, and could it have been stopped earlier?
So it's always hard to say whether something could be stopped earlier. We want to obviously be careful in hindsight to say that. But had there been on these various programs, pre-review of an applicant's, first of all, whether it was a legal entity, did it really exist? Was the email address coming from overseas? Was it from an IP address, coming from overseas? As we just reported on, did names, date of births, and social security numbers match what's in SSA, Social Security Administration's records? That's an easy check. Were they on a do not pay list? There were multiple steps that could have been taken in many of these instances that could have, at a minimum, paused, hit the pause button, take a second look to make sure they're eligible.
Mr. Chairman, I know my time's up, but I'd like to make one quick comment. I'm really concerned about what Mr. Horowitz said about the 2016 bill being passed on how to prevent fraud, and the agencies were slow to implement. We have got to get to the root of these kinds of things and say to these agencies, and fire people if they don't do things they're supposed to do. That is our biggest problem in the federal government. Nobody can be held accountable. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Krishnamurti.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, I want to ask you about your ongoing investigations involving transnational criminal actors defrauding our pandemic relief programs. It looks like in a statement that the Secret Service put out in December, you talked about a group called APT 41. Are you familiar with that group?
Yes, sir.
And it says in your statement, APT 41 is a quote-unquote Chinese state-sponsored cyber threat group that is highly adept at conducting espionage missions and financial crimes for personal gain. Are you familiar with that?
I'm familiar with the article, sir. Yes, sir.
And apparently, according to this same article, this group, the APT 41 Chinese state-sponsored cyber gang, stole tens of millions of dollars in U.S. COVID relief benefits, including SBA loans, unemployment insurance funds in over a dozen states. Isn't that right?
That's what the article stated, yes, sir.
Now tell me, sir, since that article came out, I gotta believe that they've probably targeted a lot of states beyond a dozen. Can you tell us how widespread the geographic coverage was in terms of the number of states that they had tried to target?
So again, I'm familiar with the article. Our National Pandemic Fraud Coordinator, who testified last summer, who I appointed to that position, as a supervisor in one of our field offices. The spirit of what he was conveying was that it is unimaginable that organized transnational criminal organized groups did not look to exploit pandemic-related fraud, no different than an American would. There are some commonalities between some of the thousands of bank accounts that we've seen used to move illicitly gained pandemic fraud resources that were also being used by some of those transnational criminal organized groups, to include the one you mentioned. It is also worth mentioning when we do have cases that involve transnational criminal organized groups or state-sponsored entities, we do employ our
Let me
partners
stop
at
you
the
there. Okay, we've now established APT 41 is a Chinese state-sponsored cyber gang. Now let me just turn your attention to Russia. Have we identified any Russian state-sponsored cyber gangs involved in pandemic fraud?
A lot of the Russian underlying pandemic-related fraud has to do with folks dealing in identity theft. So for decades, we've known forms wherein people
State-sponsored, though. Are they state-sponsored?
Sir, the Secret Service focuses on financial crimes. Whether or not an entity is state-sponsored or not is generally not why we tend to focus on them. We follow money, and if that leads us to a state-sponsored actor, we don't stop the case, but we then employ our partners at DOJ.
And have you come across that link yet? In other words, that required a referral to DOJ?
The referral to DOJ is actually part of the task force the DOJ started at the beginning of the pandemic. So there are cases wherein we have some linkages or commonalities between cases we're working for financial crime reasons, and there may be a state-sponsored actor that has some commonalities there.
Okay, so now we've established that there have been Chinese state-sponsored cyber gangs as well as Russian state-sponsored and linked to the state individuals who've committed pandemic relief crimes.
Sir, what I said was that there are commonalities between some of the accounts and other indicators we've seen. That's what I said.
Okay. Now, with regard to APT 41 in particular, in your statement, I'm sorry, the U.S. Secret Service's
Yes, sir.
statement, it said it was quote-unquote state-sponsored. Now, have you been able to identify any evidence that the Chinese Communist Party ordered or asked this particular cyber gang to commit this fraud, or do we have evidence that they just merely looked the other way and permitted them, knowing them, to have committed this fraud?
Sir, I have no evidence as to what the Chinese government ordered a transnational criminal organized entity to do.
Are there any other cyber gangs, state-sponsored, either Chinese or Russian or any other state-sponsored criminal gangs that have committed pandemic fraud?
Sir, just last year, we disrupted a transnational criminal organized group known as Black Axe. They're Nigerian-based. They were operating in South Africa, and they have a long-standing history of committing a lot of different types of fraud, and they used a lot of the pre-existing money mules. There's an extensive money mule network that operates here in the States. Again, even the transnational criminal organized groups overwhelmingly used or leveraged an American profile to facilitate pandemic-related fraud. So we did see that, and we had an operation that disrupted that group just last year.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Mr. Groffman for 5 minutes.
Sure. A few more questions, follow-up questions for Mr. Smith. Could you give me a little more information as far as a stereotype, as far as fraud being committed by people abroad or fraud being committed by immigrants?
What was the last word? Fraud being committed by what was
Immigrants.
the second part?
Immigrants.
So I'm not going to get into stereotypes. We follow money, we follow evidence, and at the end of the day, as I mentioned to the previous committee member, the majority of the cases we've seen, even if there is a criminal looking to exploit pandemic-related fraud abroad, they used an American mule. We had certain campaigns that our cyber fraud task forces communicated to don't be a money mule, whether witting or unwitting, because what we saw was a lot of Americans being utilized to move money abroad, because the criminals didn't know that overwhelmingly what we were looking for were, American bank accounts, American identities to issue money to. So they used that and leveraged an extensive network of money mules that preside overwhelmingly here in the United States to get that money into their hands.
Well, there would be an example. Is the mule in America, have contacts within the foreign nations? I mean, are they immigrants from the foreign nations? Are they just grabbing a random person off the street? I mean, could you comment on these mules?
So we have, dozens of cases, hundreds of cases where, we would have a person in fill-in-the-blank state, one state comes to mind, where there was a mule that had literally funneled $12 million to some criminals that resided abroad. And once we start following the money, once we start looking at some of the commonalities in bank accounts, and we have an opportunity to go interview a person.
Right. Could you tell me what those countries were abroad, and could you tell me the background of the mules here? Did they have connections to the country abroad?
So one of the cases, as I mentioned a second ago, was out of South Africa, focused on some Nigerian individuals in a group called Black Axe. That case I just mentioned with the $12 million was one of the cases wherein a money mule sent money to accounts that were operated by Black Axe. And I want to impress upon the group here Money mules are not a new concept. Like there's an extensive network of people.
Right.
looking to
You're not
take advantage of-
answering my question.
Sir.
Presumably, they got these mules somewhere. Okay, you mentioned Nigeria, you mentioned South Africa. Were the people who did the work in America connected in those countries in any way? Were they immigrants from those countries? Were they just random people they found on the internet, or were they immigrants from those countries?
Not necessarily, sir.
I know not necessarily, but does it happen? And how often does it happen?
Overwhelmingly, in our experience, that does not happen. People just take it. Criminals just take advantage of folks looking to make a quick buck, and the pandemic offered that opportunity with the amount of resources that were made available.
Okay, now in general, Mr. Horowitz, I can think of flaws in these programs that the fraud would be almost predictable. But can you tell us in the future what things we can do in programs so the fraud is not committed so easily?
So I think one of the easiest things to do that wasn't done is to prepare, as the Comptroller General said, by employing verification tools, identity verification tools. The amount of identity theft was extraordinary here. And it needs to be addressed because we're not only talking about when that occurs, theft from a government program, theft from the taxpayers, but for anybody who's been on the receiving end of having their identity stolen, you understand how you're victimized in that way. And just in the fraud alert we indicated, we now have 200,000 Social Security numbers that were used that we need to follow up on to see if those individuals' identities were stolen.
So in other words, the money is going to someone other, is going to an account or something other than the person who's committing the fraud.
Correct. So what's happening is individuals are claiming that they are the person whose name's on the application, whose date of birth is on the application, and or whose Social Security number is on the application. When we checked and went to Social Security Administration to ask them to verify it, a check they can do, we entered into that. They were doing large-scale verification for us. They came back and said, those don't all match for those 212,000 numbers, which means somebody, in some instances, it could be a false positive. Somebody could have transposed their Social Security number down or their date of birth down. So there are going to be some of those. But presumably for most of them, those are individuals who obtained on the dark web through other means Social Security numbers that were previously stolen from individuals and had their identity stolen.
And then they wind up going to a bank account that has this person's name on it, but this person doesn't even know the bank account.
Gentleman's time's expired, but we'll let you finish the question.
Yeah, certainly there's an ability to go to the bank, particularly if, as with the PPP program, the agency has said, you don't need to do anything other than accept the person's verification that it's them. In other words, all that had to happen in the PPP program at the outset was you went to the lender, you signed an application saying, no, I'm really this person, and they accepted it. No one can walk into a bank today and go to get a loan and say, no, really, I'm this person, give me the money. But that's what was going on.
Chair recognizes Ms. Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, this question is for you. Democrats provided the Department of Labor Inspector General $25 million in the American Rescue Plan to combat fraud and corruption in the process. Also in the American Rescue Plan, Democrats made critical investments in fraud prevention and accountability, including providing more than $200 million in funding for watchdogs to investigate fraud, waste, and abuse, as well as $2 billion to support states' modernization of unemployment insurance systems to reduce fraud vulnerabilities. The Biden administration has begun using these funds to support state efforts to make unemployment insurance systems both more accessible to eligible recipients and less susceptible to fraud. The American Rescue Plan provided significant funding to the Pandemic Recovery Accountability Committee as well. Yet my Republican colleagues voted against these common sense measures to reduce fraud. When the American Rescue Plan became law, Mr. Horowitz, you released the following statement, and here I'm quoting you. The enactment of the American Rescue Plan adds to the important independent oversight responsibilities of the PRAC and its members, inspector generals. We appreciate the ongoing support from Congress and the administration of the PRAC and its oversight mission, end quote. Mr. Horowitz, how much funding did the PRAC receive in the American Rescue Plan to perform the vital oversight functions?
In the ARP, in the American Rescue Plan, the PRAC received $40 million of funding.
Now, Mr. Horowitz and Mr. Dodaro, what other resources and authorities do you need to continue your work?
So, as I mentioned in my written statement at the outset, I think very important to continue the data analytics platform. That $40 million that was in the American Rescue Plan covered our ability to start the data analytics platform we have in 2021. It's funded through 2025, but we sunset on September 30, 2025. We turn the key off at that point, unless it's extended. Congress invested $40 million to fund that over 4.5 years. That's $15 million, $16 million we're spending right now. Just the fraud alert alone this past week, we identified $5.4 billion of potential fraud. That's 360 times the amount of money that we spent this year, or spending this year, to run our data analytics platform. In other words, it would take us 360 years of spending at that number to add up to $5.4 billion. So that, I think, is very critical.
Yeah, I would agree. I want to throw my support behind the establishment of this platform, a data analytics platform. Right now, it only applies to pandemic spending, and it's going to expire. This happened back after the Recovery Act, as I mentioned in my opening statement, and it was a very effective process then, but it expired in 2015. Now, if it had been in place at the beginning when the CARES Act was passed in 2020, I think we could have saved a lot of money and prevented fraud or went after it earlier. But it wasn't established to the American Rescue Plan in 2021. So by that point, hundreds of billions of dollars have been already spent. So I think this is a prudent investment on the part of the federal government to have this capability in the IG community on an ongoing basis. It will more than pay for itself many times over.
In addition to the funding, Democrats included funding to the American Rescue Plan to provide grants to states to engage their local community organizations that represent those eligible for benefits. The goal is to help states learn how to more effectively reach these traditionally underrepresented and under-resourced communities. So may I ask you, Mr. Horowitz and Mr. Dodaro, will these types of investments in the community engagement help you separate paperwork errors, other unintentional mistakes, and actual fraud?
I think it's important to recognize, and we have ongoing work, so we're going to be looking at that issue to see how effective labor is working with the states and with those entities. So that's very important. You know, today we focused a lot on the fraud part of the unemployment insurance program, but on the benefit side, there was lack of timely benefits that were given to people. We found also some disparities in terms of how different people, different races have been treated. So there's a lot to be done in the unemployment insurance area to make sure there are timely payments made to the proper people in a balanced, equitable fashion while stopping fraud on the other area. Now, we've added the unemployment insurance program along with the PPP and the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program to the list of high-risk areas across the federal government. The unemployment insurance area is badly in need of transformation, not only in dealing with these community organizations, but the IT systems in the states are terribly antiquated and not capable of executing this type of program in the future until they're modernized.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witnesses. To date, do we know the full amount of improper payments, COVID funds, Mr. Dodaro?
There are estimates that have been made on the unemployment insurance area in 2020. The estimate was improper payments was $78 billion, up from about $9 billion in 2020. And then there was another $18.9 billion of improper payments reported by the unemployment insurance program for 2022. And that was a 22% error rate.
Yeah.
And the year before was an 18.9 error rate. Prior to the pandemic, it was about 9%. In the PPP and idle areas combined, it is about $36 billion.
So we're talking $135 billion.
Yeah, just in those
doing the
few
math in
programs.
my head,
Yeah.
as you know I like to do.
Yes, I do.
It appears to me that some federal agencies might not have been as forthcoming with information as both you and Mr. Horowitz would have needed. Small Business Administration potentially violated federal law by failing to respond to the GAO's request. Has that been the case, that they've not responded to your request?
It was early on in the start of the programs. It's gotten much better. And I actually had to go, and back in 20 and 21, I testified before the Coronavirus Select Committee, and I had called the chair and ranking members of the small business committees, both the authorizers and the appropriators, to get help. I mean, we couldn't get any information out of SBA at all. And it wasn't until later there was a lawsuit where they had to then disclose the amounts of loans. Now it's gotten better.
Well, one of the problems is that the unemployment insurance programs authorized under the CARES Act were excluded from the program's total reported improper payments because they were not in existence for more than 12 months. And these programs, 70% of the unemployment payments in 2020. Should Congress consider legislation to reform the improper payments reporting periods in order to more accurately track the COVID relief funds and in the future if we have to have this again?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of my legislative recommendations.
I would appreciate, and I've enjoyed working with both you and Mr. Horowitz over the years on things like this, if you would provide to me in writing your recommendations for legislative fixes. I want to move to something else. It's been discussed about what actions Republicans took, and I just want to ask you if we had required two-factor identification for online applications or provide state unemployment agency by fax, email, or other means of transmission a copy of the claimant's state ID, if we had utilized protocols to prohibit applications from foreign IP addresses, if we denied claimants using virtual private network identification, require individuals, I could go down this whole list of things. Would that have helped reduce the amount of fraud?
Yes.
Well, I just want to point out, Mr. Chairman, that these are recommendations that were made by Republicans in the House and Senate, including myself. I introduced a bill to do this that were largely ignored. When we began to see the massive amount of fraud, as early as I think April, May of 2020, Mr. Horowitz, I think, and working with the Department of Labor, the Office of Inspector General there, that billions of dollars had already gone out, and we couldn't get these guardrails back in. Would that have helped, Mr. Horowitz?
Absolutely, and the fraud did start right off the bat. I mean, the PPP program sent out $400 billion in 2 weeks.
Let me ask one other question. What we've seen in the last few months here is states using their COVID relief funds for things like New Jersey, $15 million in state and local fiscal recovery funds to bolster the state's bid to host the 2026 World Cup. We saw the state of Washington send out $128 million in $1,000 payments to 120,000 illegal immigrants. We saw Colorado Springs use $6.6 million to put an irrigation system at 2 local golf courses, $5 million state of Massachusetts pay off debts incurred by the Edward N. Kennedy Institute for the U.S. Senate in Boston. Are any of those improper uses of funds? I mean, I know we wanted to give them flexibility, but isn't that a little bit out of the box?
Yeah, well, there are broad uses authorized in the legislation for that money. We're looking at it right now, and so we'll try to identify those areas. They may be out of bounds legally, but it reminds me of the Recovery Act, when there was a lot of questions about the use of the money, whether that was appropriate or not, when it was really, legally authorized, because we gave the government gave great flexibility to the state and local community to make decisions. The other issue you have to deal with always is the money at the state and local level is fungibility of the money.
Well, they didn't have that early on, and Mr. Chairman, I think this might be something we want to look into, because it's not just the fraud, it's the improper use of some of the funds, and my time has expired. I always enjoy hearing from you guys. I yield back.
Absolutely. Chair recognizes Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. This hearing is called Federal Pandemic Spending, a Prescription for Waste, Abuse, and Fraud. UI, unemployment assistance, the Paycheck Protection Program, all of it. And in the wind-up to this hearing on January 13th, I see that the chair sent several letters to 3 states, Pennsylvania, California, and my home state of New York, with serious allegations of widespread fraud and abuse. But I'm curious a little bit about how we got to these 3 states. Mr. Dodaro, if you were auditing or investigating what went wrong in states in the distribution of pandemic-related unemployment insurance, how would you go about choosing which states to examine?
Well, we would look at a number of factors. One would be the amount of money that would go there. We would look for geographic distribution of the programs. We would look for other characteristics of state programs, a number of claims, for example, that have been there. And so we would take a nationwide sample.
And even, in your experience looking at perhaps even something like a per capita approach or in your expertise, if you had to estimate some of the top candidate states, what do you think some of those states would be and why? And again, more on like a per capita level.
Yeah, I don't have the per capita numbers in my head, so I don't want to venture a guess at this point. I'd be happy to provide something for the record.
Overall, let's say not from per capita, what would be some of the top states that you would look at in terms of your experience and oversight of these programs?
Well, certainly California and New York are always candidates to look at in those cases, but you have Michigan, you have Florida, you have states in the South and the West, and so we would have a geographic distribution in order to make sure that we cover the money. What we try to do in these cases is cover, like right now, we're looking at the state and local coronavirus relief fund, and we've selected 18 states, and we're looking at, they account for about 60% of the total amount of money.
Thank you, Mr. Dodaro. I'd like to submit to the record this report from the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee entitled Key Insights State Pandemic Unemployment Insurance Programs. Now, Mr. Horowitz and Mr. Dodaro, can you think of any methodology that would have brought the committee to send those 3 letters specifically to just those 3 states? Is there any methodology you can think of done by this committee?
Well, I would defer to the committee. I don't really know what their objectives were in that case, and I don't think.
I understand.
Yeah.
Now, I want to dig into this report. According to this report in PRAC, for example, Arizona paid $1.6 billion to individuals to stolen identities to get unemployment insurance benefits. Louisiana dispersed more than $1 million to individuals after the date of their death. And in Kentucky, state employees applied for unemployment benefits while still employed by the state and were able to hack the state's information management system and remove holds on their own accounts. And none of these states have been put under investigation by this committee. I find it very interesting because, as was stated at the beginning, the bipartisan nature of oversight is what gives it its power. And what we are seeing are investigations into, and I believe that the methodology for these three states is highly questionable. I ask for this committee, if we're going to perform oversight, then let's perform oversight. Congressional Democrats are ready to perform that oversight and help our constituents get the benefits they need to pay their bills. And I think that there's no shortage of members of this committee who are willing to stand up to their own party when it's necessary. But I cannot, for the life of me, understand why the majority would send these three letters just to these three states that leave us with no other conclusion that there may be some rank partisanship in this investigation. Committee Republicans, I ask, if we're going to start off, let's do it right. And with that, I yield my time.
Before I yield back, if the Ms. Ocasio-Cortez is willing, I would love to join in a joint investigation of the Kentucky unemployment system and New York unemployment system if you wanted to do that, a joint probe or whatever. I would love to work with you on that, or any of the 50 states, because I believe it's a problem in all 50 states, especially Kentucky. You're exactly right. Chair recognizes Mr. Higgins for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We knew there'd be fraud because fraud is always connected to money. I supported the CARES Act. It was the nation's initial response to the new virus. We didn't know what it was. The CARES Act was our effort to respond and to help American families and American employees remain financially stable while we endured the impact of this unknown virus. So here we are into year 4 of 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and is very well falls upon this committee under Republican majority to begin conducting meaningful oversight into the massive fraud that was no doubt staged to take place when you start rolling out programs with trillions of dollars. Some estimates as high as $7 trillion, the total economic commitment from the United States of America. American treasure, $7 trillion. That's 7,000 billion. It's 140 billion per sovereign state. There's an average of 62 counties per state. That's over 2 billion per county. I would argue that Americans across the country in local and state government would say they'd have done much better if every county could have received $2.2 billion in the form of a block grant. Of course, there was going to be massive fraud with programs like this, but what we expected was not the absence of fraud. What Americans expected is the presence of accountability and criminal prosecution. And that's what that accountability is what this Republican-controlled oversight committee is going to deliver. We know fraud is not born in the mechanisms of man. Fraud is born in the heart of man. It's to be anticipated. The gentleman referred to certain trade-offs between urgency and processes that were put in place as these trillions of dollars were set to be dispersed. Well, may I say that we anticipated this, but some of us, in order for the most conservative of us to support a $2 trillion response to this unknown virus, we insisted that this money be made available through local banks and credit unions, and we pushed the SBA product out through, my recollection is about 4,500 lending institutions that had never handled SBA product before. We wanted and we insisted that regular Americans would be able to communicate directly with the bankers they knew to access this assistance. So we knew it was ripe for fraud, but we expected criminal investigations to take place, and we expected people to be put in jail. Accountability for criminal acts generally begins with a suspicion and a report at the local level of fraud, theft, forgery, identity theft, etc. That leads to an investigation, should lead to an arrest, should lead to prosecution, should lead to conviction and incarceration. May I say, America would be just fine had we witnessed that kind of accountability, but it has to be pushed out of congressional investigations. That hasn't happened for the last 3 years. It will happen now. Director Smith, sir, specifically regarding investigations, that it's understandable that the most massive cases will be prioritized, millions and millions of dollars, but according to my research, the vast amount of fraud that we have witnessed is primarily from smaller cases, and I've been advised that they've gone ignored. Can you speak to that, sir? What are we doing at the federal level to assist local and state investigators to go after these smaller cases?
Sir, as I mentioned before, we follow money, we follow evidence, and one of the things that I talked about in my opening was the Secret Service training state, local law enforcement professionals at our National Computer Forensics Institute. It's the ultimate teach a man to fish, if you will. We train thousands of state and local law enforcement professionals every year to be able to investigate cases locally. I was just down in the chairman's home state last week in Kentucky, talking to some of our cyber fraud task force partners, and they were actually briefing me on cases they were working at a local level that were focused on elder abuse and some pandemic-related fraud. So we are a federal law enforcement entity, but we do have a responsibility to help train, equip, and resource our local partners who help us in every aspect of our mission to be able to build their capacity locally.
Thank you for your response, Director. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Porter for 5 minutes.
Good morning. I have questions about unemployment insurance. Mr. Dodaro, could you read this headline for the room? Yeah. Could you hold your microphone on, sir?
I'm sorry. California's EDD unemployment system disaster, predictable fiasco.
Thank you. Mr. Horowitz, could you please, we're going to get everyone in on the fun. Mr. Horowitz, could you please read this headline?
There is no way I can read this headline
Okay,
because
I'll
I
read
didn't
it
bring
for
my
you.
glasses with me.
EDD's new software has thousands of defects, some critical. Mr. Smith, we'll see. It's also an eye test in case you need to get a checkup. Can you read that for me, Mr. Smith?
It says the North Carolina Unemployment Agency is a broken system.
A broken system. North Carolina Unemployment Agency, a broken system. Mr. Horowitz, do these headlines seem familiar? Do they seem representative of the problems regarding unemployment system during the pandemic?
They do.
They do. Would it surprise you to know that all of these news stories are from 2013 and 2014, long before COVID-19 was a problem?
Not at all. This has been an issue that GAO has spoken about for decades, maybe. I'm not sure if it's that long, but certainly we have as IGs as well. The unemployment insurance system needs to be fixed.
I could not agree more. So let's talk about that and how we can fix it. What these headlines show, of course, is that, as you said, state unemployment agencies have long had problems getting help to people who need it and preventing our tax dollars from ending up in the wrong hands. When the pandemic first began, we needed to deliver relief quickly. But due to chronic underinvestment in technology and systems at states that administer programs, we saw the same problems with waste, fraud, and abuse that we've seen for decades under Democratic and Republican presidents in blue states and red states. Mr. Dodaro, I want to talk about the GAO's high-risk list. What is that?
A high-risk list was originally created to identify for the Congress and the administration areas across federal government that we believe were highly susceptible to fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement, or in need of broad-based transformation as it evolved.
Did GAO identify unemployment system, UI, as a high-risk program?
Yes.
When?
In 2022.
June of 2022. In June of 2022, the year before unemployment was added to the high-risk list, do you know what the rate was of overpayment for unemployment insurance?
It was, in 2021, it was 18.9%.
Great. And according to the Department of Labor, before you put it on the high-risk list, it was about 15%. In 2019, it was about 9.5%. In 2018, it was 12.1%. In fact, the overpayment rate has been over 10% for 14 of the last 18 years, according to the Department of Labor's OIG. When GAO announced that the unemployment system had been designated as high risk, you said, quote, GAO is concerned that many long-standing problems may go unaddressed. Do you remember saying that?
I believe so, yes.
Is that a little bit of an understatement at this point?
Well, you know, for many of those years, it was mostly state money that was collected. There really wasn't big federal investment in this until the pandemic broke, or perhaps earlier in some other emergency situation. So, but I thought the time obviously was right.
Yeah, what the OIG has said is the UI program has experienced some of the highest improper payment rates across the federal government. So my question is, why don't we fix this?
Well, I think it requires some leadership on the part of the Congress and the Labor Department. You know, like a lot of these programs that where the federal government's relying on the state and local governments, they give them a lot of discretion. And when times are good, unemployment's low, you know, they don't get a lot of attention until these problems come up.
So here's how I think about this. When someone has $1 and they lose a dime of it, they think, shucks. But when someone has $100 and they lose $10, they're like a little angry. And it just keeps going up, and now we're in the billions and trillions. So I would love to have your continued pressure on the Department of Labor to use all of the funding that Congress provided in the American Rescue Plan to actually modernize UI, because I'm trying to add up where that $2 billion from the American Rescue Plan has gone, and it does not seem to have all been deployed and spent to improve these programs.
Yes, no, I agree. We're going to follow that $2 billion. Also, I was in the Senate testifying in last March with Michael Horowitz and the IG from the Labor Department. He mentioned the money that was given states after the Great Recession to reform the programs, and he mentioned some of that money went unused.
No, it absolutely did, and Mr. Chair, if you'll indulge me for just 1 minute. In California, after the American Recovery Act, they were given a $2 million grant to EDD to prevent fraud. And guess what? It worked. At the end of the grant program, California quit using the fraud detection program. Penny wise and pound foolish, because that exact fraud detection program would have prevented and saved tens of billions of dollars for federal taxpayers during this pandemic. So I appreciate the chairman's indulgence, and I yield back.
Mr. Palmer, you want to be recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to affirm the gentlelady from California. Mr. Dodaro and I have worked on this for quite a while, and over half of the problems with improper payments are antiquated data systems at the state and federal level, administrative error, and failure to verify eligibility. So I want to affirm what you just said. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Sessions for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Dodaro, welcome. Mr. Horowitz, good to see you again. I'd like to focus my question to you while it's this general subject. We've had conversation about ideas that went back and forth with the administration. Is there anybody at work? How are they there? You working with them? They're answering questions? Give me an idea about people at work, at least for the last 2 years. What has that been like?
Yeah, no, we are engaged with folks. The Labor IG has been engaged with the Labor Department to try and address longstanding problems. As the Congresswoman said, this is not new. We've been engaged with OMB leadership and White House leadership to try, along with the Labor IG, to try and push these issues forward and get them addressed, because the numbers are staggering.
Well, if they're staggering, then what's the progress that they have come back to? You've had meetings. What have they said?
We've made some progress. Just to give you a sense of some of the basic issues, the Labor IG, because these programs are managed by 54 entities, the 50 states and other territories, the Labor IG needed to send regularly subpoenas to the 50 states to get the data, because that data isn't housed at the Labor Department.
So all 50 states denied information?
No, they didn't. But to get it, you needed to go to them and ask for it, and they needed a legal process to be able to send it. So we now have it at the PRAC. We're looking at it. Just give you an example. It was found because it's this locally based system. One Social Security number we've identified to date so far was used in 29 states because the systems don't talk to each other. They're not managed at the Labor Department at the federal level. They're managed at the state level. And frankly, it's not fair to blame the states for that. They're not resourced to be able to fix and modernize their various systems. Some states have done more than others, but they're all, I think, it's fair to say, if not all, most are struggling with this.
But not a new issue.
Not a new issue at all. And GAO has probably been at the forefront of that with the Labor IG, speaking of this.
I think, part of the problem, Congressman Sessions, is there's not sustained attention to these issues over time. And these issues require multi-year efforts. And, we've been working with the agencies, but quite frankly, where they're state-administered programs, Medicaid's another one, for example, which has huge improper payments, where it's administered at state level, the federal agencies give a lot of discretion to the states, and quite frankly, there's not enough oversight on the part of the states. Now, this is a particular issue in the unemployment insurance program because in normal times, it's state money that's leveled on employers that pay, and there's no federal funds involved until there's an issue where they need the money. And so there's not a good sense of direction as to how involved our country wants the federal government to be involved in state-administered systems. And so you run into a federalism issue a bit with these programs, and quite frankly, I think it would benefit from congressional oversight and direction as to what signals that you want to send to these.
Okay, well, we agree with that, Mr. Dodaro. Is there still such a thing that we invented with you years ago, 97, the high-risk series?
It's still there. And
still there.
And SBA, 2 programs are on emergency loans, are on the high-risk list, along with the unemployment insurance program. And there's 37 areas. We're getting ready for our normal update at the beginning of each new Congress. So we're ready to unveil the update on the list soon.
That'd be great. One question, is this information on your website for the agency, or where do we find this information?
It's on our website. We have a whole special section, a medallion. It's gao.gov, And there's, on our homepage, there's a medallion that says high-risk list.
Great. I want to thank all three of you. The gentleman, Mr. Smith, please know that the Secret Service is a valuable organization to us, but you should know that you've got employee problems that we've been trying to work on for years, and I encourage your management to look at that, about how they treat their employees and how quickly they respond back to the needs of those people. And I appreciate each of your time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Gomez for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the first hearing of a 2-year session, and I want to be very clear to the American people what I believe that the majority, the Republicans in this committee and in Congress will do over the next 2 years. They will attempt to rewrite history. They will attempt to absolve themselves of any of the decisions they made over the last 2 years in order to fit their own political narrative. Everything from the pandemic response to January 6th to holding President Trump accountable himself. We've even had colleagues here that believe that some of the January 6th insurrectionists were patriots and heroes. They're not. They're traitors. That's what those are. Those insurrectionists were traitors. So let's focus on unemployment insurance. The chairman and the majority of the Republicans voted 3 times in 2020 for UI benefit extension. 3 times. And that's a good thing, because it put money in the pockets of Americans who were struggling to make rent, to pay food, just to get by. But after a month of voting to extend those benefits, 1 month later, they voted to slash and to stop those unemployment benefits. What changed? Did they not know about some of the concerns of that program at that time? No. What changed was we had President Biden. My hunch is if it was President Trump, they probably would have voted to extend those benefits once again, but it wasn't. And why are they cherry picking this program and not focusing on other programs? So now let's talk about the Paycheck Protection Program. You know, as members, we voted to put the money in the pockets of constituents who need it the most, to keep their small business afloat. We voted to put money in their pockets, not members of Congress. We have colleagues from Georgia who had $183,504 forgiven. Other Republican members had up to $4.3 million forgiven. Why not focus on this program? That's because if they did, they would have to answer these questions regarding their own businesses, their own loans, and why were those forgiven and not others. So if we want to talk about handouts, we want to talk about fraud, let's talk about it. Let's not cherry pick programs. Let's pick all the programs that were in place during the pandemic. Let's talk about if we want to do oversight, let's do it. But this isn't about oversight. It's about passing the buck and making one too. So don't be fooled. The American people shouldn't be fooled by them trying to rewrite history and their role and responsibility and the implementation of those programs. I believe they were a good thing. Yes, no program is perfect, but it really did keep afloat the American economy, the American worker, and made sure that we didn't fall into a deep, deep recession. So with that, let's focus, Inspector General, on the PRAC estimates on its website. That we spent it says the PRAC estimates on the website said that we spent roughly $653 billion in pandemic expanded unemployment. However, your website also points out less than a quarter of that could potentially be improper and less than that was fraud. Can you speak to the fact that a substantial majority of funds did what they were intended to do and keep Americans out of poverty and save lives?
Certainly, Congressman. In all of the work we've done and the oversight work, no one has suggested or in any way sought to undermine the importance of these programs. We all can recall what was going on in March of 2020, April of 2020, and the need to assist and help people. The problem has been not that the programs were well-intentioned or valuable. The problem is we've seen substantial amounts of that money not going to the people it was intended to help because of the fraud. We have also had hearings and panels and programs about the scope of the identity fraud, such that, for example, we heard how in the unemployment insurance program, individuals who were intended beneficiaries, sometimes when they went to get benefits, were denied because the state agency thought they were the fraudster, not the person who came first, who was the actual fraudster. And so they struggled to just get the benefits they were entitled to. That's why these programs need to be fixed and addressed, because Congress meant the money to go to the people who really needed it. And that's where we should be putting our efforts.
Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Biggs.
Thank you.
5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for all of you. I'm sorry I've been in and out doing multiple hearings as we do. It's good to see you again, Mr. Horowitz. Mr. Dodaro, it's good to see you, and welcome to Mr. Smith. So I guess I'm going to try to broad shoot this thing here. Is there any money not expended in any of the COVID relief packages that you're aware of?
Yes, there's about, as of November 2022, there's about 157 billion unobligated funds.
Okay, unencumbered, unobligated, unspent.
Right.
Okay, great, thank you. And what is the total amount that you estimate was spent through either fraud, improper payments, or waste in any of those programs? Go ahead, Mr. Horowitz.
So, Congressman, it's even at this point too early to give any estimate that's reasonable. What I've said before, and I'll say again, it's clearly in the tens of billions of dollars. It wouldn't surprise me if it exceeds ultimately more than $100 billion. But we have so much work to do. It's why Congress extended the statute of limitations last year to 10 years. We're in year 3. And that's why we need that extension on the unemployment insurance side as well. So we're going to be counting and figuring this out for years to come. We're going to go after every penny we can. We're going to use every tool you give us, but it's going to take time, and we're not there yet.
Yeah, so, Mr. Smith, I read that you had returned through an analysis of, I think, 30,000 financial institutions, something about $3 billion to unemployment insurance benefits. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And then, I want to get to this because I think this is interesting. During the last round of questioning, the assertion was made that there was $653 billion overall in unemployment insurance that was disseminated through those programs, and that the estimate was somewhere below 25% was improper payments, fraud, or whatever. So if that's the case, though, we're talking, I mean, is that accurate? Is that, first of all, I want to just make sure I don't want to be misstating something. That's what I understood the testimony to be.
Yeah. The Department of Labor estimated for 2021 improper payments of $78 billion, which is about an 18.9% rate. And in 2022, it estimated 18.9 billion. That's a 22% improper payment rate. And so those are the estimates of the Department of Labor. Now, it's mostly those estimates are for the regular unemployment benefits. It's not for the Pandemic Unemployment Insurance Fund. So those aren't complete estimates for all the federal spending that was made during the period of time.
Okay.
Labor Department is now trying to figure out the Pandemic Unemployment Insurance Program. That's the one that went to people who were self-employed or working part-time, or, that was the new program that was created. The other federal programs extended the benefits or added to the benefit during that period of time. Those estimates are covered, and those programs are covered by the estimates, but not the other one, the new one.
Doggone, I'm more confused now than ever. But I'm just...
yeah. Well, I just want to be clear on exactly what's happening.
No, I appreciate that.
Right.
And as we go forward, maybe we could get together and just kind of suss out a little bit what that range might look like in totality versus.
Yeah, no, what we've done is we've estimated on the unemployment insurance area, if you take the fraud rate and extrapolate it, that the low end of the estimate is greater than 60 billion.
Yeah, I saw that.
Right, and now we're working to try to figure out an estimate. Again, no one that will know. I agree with Michael until all these investigations are underway. As I mentioned, the Labor Department IG is opening up 100 new investigations every week. And the PPP program has over 500 investigations underway. So there'll be investigations into fraud on this for a period of time. But we're trying to give a sense of what we think the magnitude would be.
Well, I look forward to continued discussion with you gentlemen. And I just have to, Mr. Chairman, my colleague from New York earlier mentioned fraud occurring within the unemployment insurance program in my home state of Arizona. What she did not mention is that Arizona actually identified the problem, partnered with a private sector company, and implemented an identity verification system, because it's kind of getting at what you're talking about there, that a Biden administration official at Treasury called, quote, kind of a silver bullet, close quote, and that, quote, almost immediately the fraud ring saw the game was up, close quote, once the tools were rolled out. And you had a 99% reduction in fraud when we implemented those measures in my state. So I'd love to take a closer look at Arizona's response, how it worked, why it worked, and maybe we get there at the federal level as well, Mr. Chairman. And so I appreciate, y'all being here today, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Very good. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and the committee for having us. We look forward to, of course, hearing from and having been heard from all of our witnesses, so thank you very much. Before joining Congress, I served as mayor of Long Beach, California. It's a city of about 500,000 people, coastal community. I was mayor during the entire time of the pandemic and the emergency. I also happen to be very proud of the response that we had as a community to this pandemic. President Biden called our response locally in Long Beach a national model. The governor of California said it was the best response from a city in the state of California. In fact, we were the first community to vaccinate 99% of our seniors. We're the first community to vaccinate all of our public school teachers in our school system. And we were the first city to reopen our public schools as a school system in the state of California. So I lived the pandemic 24 hours a day, every single day since it started. And I think it's important, as we have this hearing and others on this important topic, because I know that the issue around the pandemic and our response will continue to be an important topic for the Congress. It's important to remember that this emergency was a catastrophic loss of life event. We've lost over a million Americans across this country, and just in Long Beach alone, we've lost over 1,300 residents, friends, families, and neighbors. Personally, I lost both my mom and my stepfather to the pandemic. My mom was a healthcare worker. And so the loss is real for a lot of us. We also saw our economy collapse. Jobs were lost, businesses were closed, folks became unhoused. And families and kids were greatly impacted, particularly around schooling and their ability to learn every single day. Now, there's been a lot of attacks by the Republicans on this committee and across the House on the Biden administration and our response, on the work that's happening in our agencies. I think it's really important to also note that we had a catastrophic emergency and that the president, the vice president, and all the folks in our agencies did and are doing the best job that they can to manage this emergency. So I want to thank the president for his response. I want to thank his continuous work that's happening right now in our recovery. A lot of folks don't realize that the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan saved lives. It saved small businesses, it saved cities, it saved nonprofits. The money that was sent to us by the federal government kept cities like Long Beach afloat and countless others across the country. It allowed us to provide food for those that were hungry. It allowed us to keep people in their homes with tenant and rental assistance. It allowed us to open homeless shelters where people were falling into homelessness. It allowed us to provide small business grants to small businesses that needed to stay open, to restaurants that were about to close. And so I am grateful to all of you that were involved in some type of oversight or implementation. I'm grateful to the federal government for providing support for our cities. And most importantly, the money from the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan provided opportunities for us to test, to vaccinate, and to keep workers employed. It's important to know that in any major crisis or emergency, there are going to be mistakes. We were all moving fast and quickly. We take them seriously and we learn from them. In California, for example, we've already seized or recovered over $1 billion in fraud and abuse. I think it's important to know that mistakes in emergencies are going to happen. But it's also to know who should be held accountable for some of these concerns being brought up by my Republican colleagues. And if Comptroller Dodaro can just remind us, who was actually president when the pandemic started?
President Trump.
Thank you for that, because I remember as mayor how difficult it was to get any sort of support from the White House. There was no PPE, we weren't getting our masks on time, we had to go procure tests ourselves, and so I am sympathetic that oftentimes in emergencies, things are going to be difficult. Us as a city had to spend $20 million of our own money immediately without knowing if we were going to get reimbursed or having support from FEMA just to keep people alive on the ground. And to Assistant Director Smith, which administration actually established the COVID-19 Fraud Enforcement Task Force?
Sir, we were protecting President Trump at the beginning of the pandemic.
But then I believe President Biden actually put in place an additional committee on fraud and abuse on the pandemic. So I say that because there's obviously going to be mistakes made across administrations, but I'm grateful to the Biden-Harris administration today for actually trying to do as best they can to address some of the abuses that are happening. I also think it's important to put the entire context of what we're talking about in this idea that we've just experienced the single largest loss of life event in the modern era of our country. So I want to thank the three of you for your service, and I want to thank the committee for bringing this up in this hearing. I yield back the rest of my time.
Before I recognize the next member, Mr. Dodaro, you said there were $137 billion in unobligated COVID funds that are still.
I believe it's 157 billion.
157 billion.
Yeah.
How much, if you have a general estimate of the total amount of unobligated funds in all agency accounts, regardless of what they were there for? Do you have an idea of what's out there?
You mean for all federal spending?
And unobligated funds?
I don't have any idea on that right now. I can find out and provide it for the record.
I would appreciate it if you would provide that.
It's a big government.
Yeah. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from South Carolina, Ms. Mays, for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank the ranking member for this hearing today. And the partisanship and the politics of this hearing is absolute and complete BS. Our country and the entire world faced a pandemic unlike anything our generation has ever faced. And some decisions were made that were good, and some decisions were made that I'm sure we're going to look back on 20 years from now and have a great heartburn over, like all of the fraud that's been committed. You know, partisanship in politics has kept us from doing our job on oversight. It keeps us from doing our job in Congress. It keeps our federal agencies from being able to be the best that they can be. And any time that the federal government spends trillions of dollars, we should ensure it's safekeeping regardless of who is in power. COVID-19 is not the fault of this administration or the past administration at all, but it's up to us. I mean, the spending and the fraud has been a product of Republicans and Democrats for generations and for decades. We've got to ensure that the safekeeping of this money is done better now than ever before. There was guidance from federal agencies on how to allocate these funds. The guidance was vague. It led to potential integrity concerns and opportunities for bad actors seeking to take advantage. And I know that at the time this was rushed and there was an urgency because of the worldwide emergency. But even with these concerns, the money kept flowing. As the last two COVID relief spending bills added to the sum total of $1.15 trillion payments to individuals, just over $1 trillion to unemployment when we literally paid people to stay home. No wonder, none of us should be surprised it was hard to get people out of their homes and back to work. And we had $779 billion for PPP loans, a total of about $5 trillion was spent roughly on COVID relief. As of today, there have been over 1,000 people convicted of fraud relating to COVID-19 problems, while over 600 are currently facing similar federal charges. And it sounds like by the testimony today, there might be thousands of more charged in the years ahead. And I appreciate everyone's testimony today, coming here and being forthright with our committee. Today, I'm encouraged by our leadership on oversight that we will leave no stone unturned to uncover waste, fraud, and abuse plaguing these programs. And the thing that I found, I think, most interesting to me in the testimony today is the data issues that we as a federal government have. You mentioned, Mr. Horowitz, about having to subpoena 50 states for data. And it doesn't matter if we're dealing with immigration or we're dealing with COVID relief fraud or we're dealing with background checks on bad guys trying to buy guns. We have a real problem with data integrations, our systems talking to one another, our legacy technology that's being utilized. And if we don't fix it soon, we're just going to be overrun with it. So I appreciate some of the ideas that have been put forth. But one of the things that does intrigue me, and I think it probably intrigues a lot of people, and this is in the few moments that I have left in the committee today, is the use of artificial intelligence in some of this and trying to find the fraud. And of course, now we all know about it since ChatGPT, 1 million users in the first 5 days, and only growing exponentially. And they're not the only ones. I mean, there's GitHub and Copilot and a bunch of others. But I would just, my questions today, and I'll start with you, Mr. Horowitz. Can you explain the type of work, how is AI being used? Is it advantageous? Is it speeding up the process? How useful is it? Just some of your feedback with the use of AI in detecting fraud.
Yeah, and thank you, Congresswoman. It's a very important question you raise, and I think at the outset people need to be cautious about it. We've also read about some of the cautions in using AI. I know IGs are doing oversight work in that space, GAO is as well, but it can be very helpful, and in fact, it's just a further advancement at some level of the analytics that we're using to try and find issues and anomalies and problems and things we should be following up on. So for example, we used a more primitive form of AI at the outset to try and help the SBA Inspector General, because they were getting in one day 1,000 or more complaints, which was more than they had gotten in the prior year in total. They needed to try and figure out and triage those. What were the highest level, most important ones? They came to the PRAC. We helped them triage that by using a form of, if you will, AI, far more primitive than what you mentioned. But those are the kinds of things we can do. It's something that we have to do as a government-wide. Agencies need to use it. Inspectors general need to use it. I know GAO uses it. It's the future of oversight.
Thank you, and I've run out of time, but I look forward to working with you all as the new subcommittee chairman on tech, cyber, and government innovation. It's going to be a huge marker for us to determine waste, fraud, and abuse in the future, and I agree. Thank you for your time today.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Ross, for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad that we're starting this committee talking about waste, fraud, and abuse and how we can make government work better for the people. Mr. Chairman, the previous comments, I agree with the initial comment that we need to take the politics out of the discussion, take the politics out of this and the posturing and the hyperbole, so that way we can work together, again, to modernize our government and make it work for the people. And I hope this committee will continue to look into other financial abuses, such as wage theft and corporate welfare, as we continue over the next 2 years. Assistant Director Smith, we've heard a lot of hyperbole and political posturing from this committee today. I think the way that we communicate and talk about an issue is extremely important in finding the solution. We've heard things like the greatest theft in our country's history. I'm curious, from the point of view from law enforcement, does that type of hyperbole when talking about crime work to exacerbate the issue?
Sir, thank you for the question. I think it's inconsequential to the bad guys as a law enforcement professional. Bad actors exploit situations no matter what the political climate is. So we focus on investigating violations of identity theft fraud, wire fraud, and bank fraud.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Dodaro, is it Dodaro, right? Yeah, okay. All the GAO's recommendations include increasing the capacity and resources of the federal government to help deal with the waste, fraud, and abuse. Oversight isn't just talking about an issue, we have to solve it. And in the spirit of solving it, can real improvements be made without additional resources and money to the government, to these departments and agencies, so that way they are set up for success to deal with the issues?
Yeah. Some of them can be made without additional resources. Some need additional resources, such as the IG community, to continue their investigations on fraud, but also to set up this analytics center. It's really a mixture of both.
Do you think that the amount of resources that were allocated during the previous administration was sufficient enough for what we were dealing with?
I think there was adequate money given. I think it was just a choice of decisions that were made in some cases. I talked about limitations in the legislation itself. The agencies made decisions that I think could have been different decisions. They were given money to help administer the programs. I think there could have been a little bit more flexibility that was given. I know Treasury's run into some problems recently because they couldn't redistribute the money among some of the programs, particularly new programs, because until you start administering them, you don't know whether it's an adequate allocation or not. Congress fixed that with the latest Consolidation Appropriation Act. But I think by and large, the resources were there. It was just some decisions that were unfortunate.
Gotcha. Thank you. Mr. Horowitz, on this committee, I've heard a lot of demonizing of Washington bureaucrats, and bureaucrats are often scapegoated. And to be clear, when we talk about bureaucrats, we're talking mainly about working class people who have decided to serve their country by working to power our government. Do you believe that one of the central issues here is that agencies and departments were not set up for success? And I'm thinking specifically about the previous administration. We got into this issue. Do you believe they were set up for success to be able to dole out the amount of money that was being given out?
I think the problem at the outset of the pandemic was, as the Comptroller General has mentioned, the lack of preparedness. Now, understanding this was a 100-year event with the pandemic, but we have emergencies all the time. We have earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, other disaster relief. It happens regularly, not at the scale perhaps as this did, but we don't take the steps after an event like this or smaller emergency events to fix what's needed. That was the problem. Just to give you a sense of it, the SBA, Small Business Administration, which administered the PPP and EIDL program, the largest amount of money they had ever given out in a loan program prior to the pandemic was $30 billion. They were giving out $50 billion in a day when the pandemic hit. So when you say, were they ready for success? Well, if you go to an agency that has experience giving out $30 billion over a year, and you say, here's $800 billion, get the money out the door, which was the initial PPP program, that's a recipe for a very challenging situation for no matter who's running the agency.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mr. Horowitz. Yeah, and I think the point here is I agree. We need to prepare for the future here, whether it's a pandemic or anything else. And I'm looking forward to working with my Republican colleagues on ensuring that we give the adequate resources and know-how to our agencies and departments, so when this happens again, we're prepared for it. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses, thank you for being here. It's actually great to have all the witnesses here in person. This is a novel thing in the 118th Congress, so really appreciate your attendance. A couple of things. It's been stated through the hearing that we want to make sure that oversight is being conducted, of course, but I would like to remind a lot of my colleagues and a lot of the freshmen who are here for the first time, there was no oversight over any of these dollars in the last Congress. I know that because I sat on this committee, and there were no oversight hearings about anything associated with pandemic spending. So I'm glad that we're tackling this now, and it's critical because the other thing that's kind of in the news cycle, especially today, tomorrow, be with us for a couple months, is we have hit our debt ceiling. We are out of money, folks. $31.5 trillion. We don't have new money. And so if you're going to take account of having to potentially raise the debt ceiling in the United States of America, you have to take account of how the federal government goes through the process of spending its money, whether through normal times or even through pandemic times. Mr. Chairman, I want to submit for the record an article by Politico. The title of the article is Biden Administration Reroutes Billions in Emergency Stockpile COVID Funds to the Border Crunch. That's the article. The article states that the administration went through a process of reappropriating, or moving around almost $2 billion from money supposed to go to the Strategic National Stockpile, and also funds intended to help study long COVID that was at the National Institute of Health, and rerouted that to actually help house migrants coming across the southern border because of the president's reckless border policy. So, Mr. Dodaro, are you aware of this reshuffling of dollars from the pandemic emergency to the southern border, in my view, failed strategy of the president?
Yes.
And Mr. Dodaro, when the president made this rerouting, what were some of the uses of funds that it was used for at the southern border?
I don't have that information right now. I'm aware of the situation, what happened, but I don't know, the details.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I will request from you and your office is, could you provide the committee those details? Because it's going to be important for the Oversight Committee to understand that when money was shuffled from pandemic response to border policy, which, by the way, was just a unilateral policy shift at the beginning of the Biden administration, that could have put American citizens at risk during the pandemic. And the reason why this is illustrative is because if we go down the line of setting precedents on how funding is going to be used, we should have an idea of what administrations have done in the past. So I think this is actually very critical information. One other point, there is money that came through the American Rescue Plan, the $1.9 trillion quote-unquote COVID bailout of the American economy. I say quote-unquote because it really didn't work. But a bunch of that money is actually supposed to go to state and local governments, including to school districts through ESSER funds. Now, Mr. Dodaro, there is another tranche of this money that is slated to go out. This goes to the previous question by Mr. Palmer about obligated funds somewhere to the tune of $500 billion that is slated to go out. And the president has now said that he's going to end the COVID emergency effective May 11th. If the COVID emergency ends effective May 11th, what is going to happen with these ESSER funds that are obligated but have not yet been transmitted?
I'll have our attorneys take a look at that to make sure, because we have appropriation law attorneys that provide assistance. But I think, I'm not sure it's tied, the funding's tied to the National Emergency Declaration in terms of what's been appropriated already. And I know some of the funds are available for use up to 2026, some up to 2030. So I don't know if the termination of the national emergency would trump what is already in the legislation in terms of how available those funds are made. But I'll have our attorneys take a look at it. My guess would be that the appropriation would be the governing factor for the uses of those funds in the future, that they would still be available. But I don't know for sure. I'll double check on that. There are some funding things, particularly in Medicaid, for example, that would have to be changed that are tied to the National Emergency Declaration.
Agreed. Medicaid is one of those things that is tied to the national emergency. I would just proffer for the committee that if we're going to go down this road of having to find a way to raise our debt ceiling, one of the things we should do is we should end letting money go out the door that was tied to the pandemic. That is now essentially over. With that, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Vermont, Ms. Balint, for 5 minutes for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, all. Thank you for being here. I'm sitting here as a new member of Congress, but I'm also sitting here as a former leader of my state Senate in Vermont, and was on essentially our state's front lines in dealing with the pandemic emergency, much like my colleague, Mr. Garcia. And I want to be clear that we all want to reduce improper payments. I think that is clear. I don't know some of my colleagues on the Republican side, but I think we all can agree that that is a goal, because it's the people's money. What I want us to do, though, is bring us back to that moment at the beginning of the pandemic. It's a moment that I remember so clearly. I had thousands and thousands of Vermonters calling my office, calling the office of all of my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, to say, we're desperate. We're desperate. We can't pay our bills. We don't have money for food. We can't pay our rental payments. And I can't convey to you the loss of sleep or the worry that we all had as state legislatures trying to protect our people. And what I'm concerned about this morning is I feel like at the heart of this hearing has been a false choice between ease of access to government assistance when disasters strike. And as Mr. Garcia said, we lost over 1.1 million Americans. And I'm sure, like many of the people in this room, I know people who succumbed to the pandemic. So I believe it's a false choice between ease of access to help alleviate fraud and making sure people get the help they need. This is about real people. It's about real families. It's about desperate people needing assistance. And so the question I have for you this morning is, do you agree with that assertion that government must either choose speed or accuracy? Because what I know is getting the money out quickly to people desperately in need saved lives in every community in my home state.
I think you can do both if you're prepared. And that's what I've said all along. I have acknowledged in all our reports the important assistance delivered to needy Americans. But there are definitely choices. I mean, one of the things, the economic impact statements, where the money went directly to individuals, there were some problems with that. You know, the first round went to 1.4 billion went to deceased individuals. We've gotten about half of that back, one of which was my own mother who had passed away earlier. My sister returned the money though, so, but in
is that on the record, Mr. Dodaro?
Yes.
Okay, just checking.
Yes, no, that is.
I'm joking.
I've already said it when I testified in 2020 on this.
Okay.
But the programs that are administered through third parties present problems. And if the agencies are prepared and they're designed properly, you can get the money out quickly, but you can also minimize the fraud. We're not saying you can ever eliminate it, but I think if the agencies are prepared, the programs are designed properly, people can get the aid they need as soon as possible. What happened with the fraud, though, is because some of these funds were limited.
Could I, Mr. Dodaro, just because I'm going to run out of time.
Yeah,
I
sure.
appreciate it. So a question, follow-up question is, can you highlight for us the ways in which we can design benefit systems with the recipient in mind, making sure that we're combating improper use of funds, but making sure it is meeting the needs of the people on the other side, those real Americans who need the help?
Right. Yeah, well, I think we need better identity verification systems to know who the people are that are applying. Mr. Horowitz talked about that. I've talked about that. We've made recommendations about that. I think the agencies ought to be better prepared to know how to prevent fraud from happening in the first place. There's a lot of different ways that those things could be done and be done properly.
I appreciate that, and I'm eager to partner with anyone on this committee that wants to address these two things simultaneously. And I just want to say, in this committee, we have to keep the people back home in mind every single day. I yield back.
Chair, I now recognize the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong, for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At this point in time, we've all seen the headlines: Paycheck Protection Program fraud, economic injury disaster loan fraud, improper unemployment payments. And I'd like to concur with my colleague from Florida. in that one of the common and unfortunate denominators to these headlines is that when they held the majority, Oversight Committee Democrats failed to hold a single hearing to protect COVID relief programs from waste, fraud, and abuse. But I think the most frightening result of this lack of oversight is that foreign hackers, including those acting on behalf of foreign countries, have tapped into these large funding mechanisms and stolen dollars meant for struggling Americans. I understand that the large scope and quick disbursement of COVID relief can result in waste, fraud, and abuse, but it's unacceptable that our strategic adversaries had such an easy means to infiltrate through cyber means. Specifically in December of last year, it was reported that a hacking group, which was talked about a little earlier as APT41, stole at least $20 million in U.S. COVID relief funds, including both unemployment insurance dollars and small business administration loans. By the time the COVID relief funds became a target of opportunity, APT41 had been in existence for about 10 years and had become the workhorse of the cyber espionage activities for the Chinese Communist Party. The hackers are believed to be connected very closely to the government, and they allegedly act on orders directly from China's Ministry of State Security. While there are many bad actors targeting government programs, this is allegedly the first strategic foe state-sponsored cyber threat of the U.S. COVID benefit funds. Assistant Director Smith, earlier you answered that the Secret Service is unsure if APT41 was directly ordered by the Chinese government to target U.S. COVID relief funds. When do you think the Secret Service expects to have resolution on if the hackers acted on their own accord or by government direction?
Sir, sometimes in the context of a criminal investigation, those answers never get reconciled. As I said before to your colleague who asked me the question originally, we focus on financial crimes, and sometimes financial crimes lead you, and the evidence leads you to entities that may have other interests in mind. Again, if that happens, we employ our partners at the Department of Justice who may also have some additional angles into how they're looking at particular groups.
And just generally speaking, whether they were working directly for them or not, I mean, the Chinese Communist Party knows of their existence, right?
I can attest to what their knowledge is or not.
Reports have stated that Secret Service recovered nearly half of the $20 million stolen by the APT41 hackers. I'm assuming you're continuing that investigation.
Yes, sir.
Do you have, these are kind of unfair in that, do you have any timelines? Do you have anything you could share with us either publicly or sometime privately?
That case is a large, very broad case out of our Denver field office, and it will be unpacking that for some time, sir.
Comptroller Dodaro, as I mentioned, hackers have targeted the unemployment insurance funds of several states, the extent of which is still unknown. What can we do outside of tearing down those entire systems in all 50 states to provide states with whatever safeguards the federal government can on unemployment insurance programs, even without enhanced COVID benefits from foreign actors?
Well, I think the Labor Department, with some of the funds that have been given available, has begun to set up identity verification methods, means to also check addresses. So those efforts need to be continued to go down the road. But cybersecurity is an issue that the federal government, governments at all levels, haven't heeded. I put that on the high-risk list across the federal government in 1997. I added critical infrastructure protection 2003. This problem's been known for a while, and I think we need to make sure we have more modern systems that can check. The other problem is allowing data sharing. For years, it took me years to get Congress to allow the Social Security Administration, or to require them to give the death master file to the Treasury Department so we could stop paying deceased individuals. That hasn't even happened yet. It's not scheduled to happen till next year, and recommending that be expedited. So there's a lot of things that could be done, but the systems have to be modernized. There are too many legacy systems. Some of the state systems go back to the 70s, and some of the federal governments are decades old as well.
Yeah, in many states, that's the
Right.
last IT upgrade everybody does.
Right.
I mean, and regardless all the way across the thing. So thank you, I yield back.
Chair recognizes Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. It's still surreal to be in this room on the Oversight Committee. In January 2023, our country has experienced multiple mass shootings and a lynching at the hands of police. And yet here we are, the very first hearing of the Oversight Committee to criticize critical unemployment benefits from a global pandemic. This isn't just politics for me. Before joining Congress, I, like many of my colleagues, served 4 years as a state legislator in Pennsylvania. Just 1 year later, we crashed head-on into this global pandemic that, frankly, we were not remotely prepared to handle. Every single day, I heard over and over and over the desperate calls of folks unable to access food banks, people facing the risk of homelessness, folks literally contemplating suicide, unable to eat or work. Every call was a real Pennsylvanian, a real person whose literal lives relied on the same benefits my colleagues see fit to criticize this morning. When the benefits were ended in September of 2021, there were 174,572 people receiving the Pandemic Emergency UC and 387,932 people receiving the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance in the Pittsburgh metro area. The pandemic relief was literally the difference between life and death for my community and communities all over the country. So focused on the people impacted, I turn to you, Mr. Horowitz. Understanding $3.1 billion was secured in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023 to protect and strengthen the federated UI system under the Department of Labor Inspector General. Can you tell us how these investments could be used to improve the federated unemployment insurance system?
Absolutely. Thank you, Congresswoman. We held hearings about the value of the unemployment insurance program and other programs to help communities, as you said, but also heard about the challenges that communities had to get the money to the right place. First and foremost, the money needs to be used to modernize IT systems. It's different state to state. Some states have older systems than others, but it seems to me one of the first things that has to happen is the funding needs to be used to modernize antiquated state systems.
Thank you. I can certainly attest that ours was a system that was entirely ill-equipped to handle this. By March of 2020, I believe, almost 1 million Pennsylvanians found themselves suddenly unemployed. With that in mind, I have the same question for Mr. Dodaro. Again, how these investments could improve the federated unemployment insurance system.
Yeah, I would echo the first comment that Mr. Horowitz made, that the IT modernization systems need to be put in place in each state. Now, each state has a different program. I mean, their eligibility requirements are different, so it has to be tailored systems. Secondly, though, I think there ought to be more data sharing or agreements made on the part of the states to work together. Mr. Horowitz gave an example before of a Social Security number, one number that was used by 29 states. That shouldn't be able to happen with the use of modern technology. I also think that the Labor Department ought to try to have states voluntarily implement fraud reduction programs. I mean, there was fraud rate of about at least 4% in these unemployment programs before the pandemic. So there's been fraud in these programs for a number of years, and the requirement for federal agencies to implement GAO's fraud reduction framework is for the federal agencies, but it doesn't cascade down to the state level, which is something I think Congress ought to consider, and labor departments helping them have fraud prevention programs. They have to make sure that they're adequately staffed properly as well. The problem was we were at historic low unemployment rates. The states had reduced their staffing systems, had old IT systems, not a prescription for success. And so I think they need to deal with those issues.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yell back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Timmons for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Dodaro, I want to begin by thanking you for your work with the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. We were able to get signed into law just in December the Improving Government for American Taxpayers Act. We hope that we can get the executive branch to act on your recommendations and probably save taxpayers billions and billions of dollars. So I just want to begin by thanking you for that. Mr. Horowitz, it seems that there's likely tens of billions of dollars in PPP loan fraud that has yet to be uncovered. Is that fair?
There is likely tens of billions.
Some estimates are as high as 100 billion, but we can just agree on tens of billions. That's fine. It seems to me that you have all of the information necessary at your disposal to identify this fairly rapidly. You look at the Q4, you get the business tax ID number, and you compare the Q4 withholdings for W-2 employees versus the amount of the PPP loan, and then the Q2 and Q3 of 2020 withholdings. And there should be an algorithm or some sort of a proportionality between those different numbers. So that should be some sort of a report that you can run, and then you can just start arresting people. Is that not how this should happen?
There might be a little more sophistication to it, perhaps,
Why?
but let me just say, we don't have access to that data.
What do you need from Congress to, because it's literally a report. You should be able to run a report on those 4 data points, and then you're going to get tens of thousands of businesses that got PPP loans fraudulently, because if the metrics don't match up, then they lied and they stole and they need to go to jail. So what do you need?
A clear congressional action in legislation that says that. It took us, the fraud alert we issued this week, matching our information, and all we did was send name, date of birth, and social to the Social Security Administration and said, don't send us back your data, just give us yes, no answers. Are these the real names? It took us 10 months to do that.
Again, we agreed that the Q4 withholdings of 2019 and the Q2 and the Q3 withholdings of 2020, plus the amount of the PPP loan, those numbers should have a proportional correlation that we can all agree is fairly straightforward. It's going to be up and down a little bit depending on how much your rent is, what your utilities are, but those numbers should all match up. And if there's a huge discrepancy in whatever that correlation is, then they probably stole and it was fraudulent. So do you just need us to force everybody to create that report?
What we need is access to data. It's what the Comptroller said about just the death master file index.
I don't even think you need access to data. You need that report run, and you need to have all the list and the discrepancy and the correlation of those 4 metrics, and then you need to go and start putting people in jail.
We need the data analytics platform to continue, and we need access to all of this data, and Congress has to legislate that.
Do you need access to the data, or do you just need Treasury to run a report?
They won't run the report unless it's clear
We can make them run the report.
That's what we would need as well then. That's
I'm
correct.
sure that this is not a partisan issue. If people stole tens of billions of dollars in COVID relief, possibly denying benefits to people that actually needed it, those people need to be held accountable. And the fact that here we are years later, and we still have not done something that should literally be as simple as running a report in a computer at the Treasury Department. I mean, you need us to pass a law making them do that.
We need a law. We would love to get employer identification number information.
Why would Treasury
to see if
not do
somebody
this?
actually exists?
Why would Treasury not do this?
Because there's federal laws like Section 6103 of the tax code that restricts sharing of tax information. We're now not talking just for the public's benefit, not individual income tax returns, what we're talking about, but 6103 is written broadly for a variety of very good reasons to limit where that information and tax information.
All right, well, look, there's 4 pieces of data that are attached to every business tax ID number, and this should be easy. I will work on legislation with everyone that is willing, and we will try to get you that information as quickly as possible. Okay. Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Kassar for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member. I am so glad that we are having this hearing. After years in local government, working 24/7 during the pandemic to save lives and jobs in Texas, I have this opportunity to thank the Congress for their work, bipartisan work on the CARES Act, and thank you to congressional Democrats for the American Rescue Plan. Congress should be proud of the way that those bills helped save people's homes, kept people in their jobs, and kept people alive. I want to be clear, no one in the country is more strongly against fraud than my working class constituents who needed those COVID dollars to make sure their small businesses kept running, to make sure they got PPE at work, to make sure they got vaccines, to make sure their house wasn't foreclosed on. Any dollar taken from those programs by fraudsters is a dollar taken away from people who needed support. And similarly, we must be against fraudulent mischaracterizations of COVID relief programs that ultimately aim to reduce aid to people in need through these programs and other programs. We can talk all day in DC about COVID programs theoretically, but as a former city leader who put these programs in place, I can tell you that thanks to the work of the Congress and President Biden, local leaders in my community, 1, saved people's homes, 2, saved local economies, and 3, saved lives. So before I ask my question, I just want to share some facts that you may not have heard from Texas. 1, we kept people from losing their homes through protections against evictions and foreclosures, plus federal housing relief dollars. The city of Austin reduced evictions in 2021 by 75%, keeping thousands of people in their homes. Conservative estimates are that COVID housing programs kept over 1 million Americans from losing their homes. 2, we saved local economies. Because these programs and this kind of funding, the city of San Antonio in my district was able to support over 1,200 small family businesses, keeping them from closing, provided 160,000 meals to residents in need, trained over 5,000 struggling workers, putting thousands of people to work. The ARP kept 12 million people out of poverty, and pandemic relief programs, according to CBO, kept GDP up 8 percentage points. And third, we saved lives. Thanks to the funding for vaccinations and public health programs, plus our COVID rules, the city of Austin had the lowest, along with Travis County, had the lowest COVID-19 death rate amongst our major Texas cities. Every death in our community was a tragedy, and if we had been able to achieve that same rate across Texas, we would have 45,000 more Texans who would have survived the pandemic. President Biden's vaccination strategy, along with local leaders' efforts, have kept nearly 500,000 people from being hospitalized. I just want to be clear, you cannot fraud your way to these lower COVID death numbers. You cannot cook the books and save this number of people from losing their homes or their jobs or their businesses. The hospital beds, the food lines, the morgues do not lie. These COVID relief programs did powerful work even while we continue to work to root out any instance of fraud. So what I want to ask our panel here today is that we, of course, need to focus on getting rid of fraud, but without telling these stories of success, we could weaponize accountability efforts to undermine these programs that you've said have helped struggling Americans. So in your time targeting fraud, can you give us examples of programs you've looked into that have functioned well, served the American people with urgency, and ensured that dollars actually got to the people that needed them the most?
I would say, Congressman, we haven't heard stories from people that said these programs are a complete waste. That is not what we've heard. We've heard success stories in many of the programs. We've talked about PPP and EIDL and the unemployment insurance. Restaurant revitalization program helped restaurants. The various state and local funding vehicles had a substantial impact. We actually have visited 6 communities as part of our oversight work and are working on a report on it to see how they used COVID-related funds, what impact it had on those communities. And so we've gone to communities around the country to get that information. The challenge has been making sure that large percentages of that money went to the people it was intended for and went to the communities it was intended to help. So I wouldn't come here and say, oh, we heard testimony these programs were bad. What we heard was these programs were helpful, and how do you fix the fraud to make sure the money goes to the right place?
Thank you for that. Of course, helping folks out in a mile-long food line, those folks aren't there committing fraud, but what we're trying to do here is make sure that we recover dollars that weren't getting to those folks.
Yeah, no, I agree with what Michael has said, but I'd also add, Operation Warp Speed, I thought was a very effective program. We were able, working with the private sector and government, to develop the vaccines in a record time. Normally it would take 10 to 15 years to develop a vaccine, but Operation Warp Speed worked, I think, extraordinarily well. The programs that provided funding to help support healthcare workers, providers was very effective as well. But all these programs had some level of effectiveness, but it could have been even more effective, is what we were saying. If all the money that was allocated was used properly, you could have maybe saved more people, helped more people out. And that's our goal.
Thank you. I think it's our goal as well. I yield back.
Gentlemen, time's expired. The chair recognizes Ms. McLean for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all for being here today. I appreciate it. A little bit of background is I come from the financial services background. And I really want to focus on the waste, the fraud, and abuse, and really to represent the American people. In my background, if I were to defraud a client, probably 2 things would happen. 1, I'd have to pay the money back. And 2, I'd probably do a little time for that. and rightly so. So I want to really focus on what are the consequences and what are the penalties, and then what is the relationship, because if I understand it correctly, it's your job, Mr. Smith, to kind of make a preliminary case and then hand it over to the DOJ. Am I directionally correct on my understanding?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
So in your testimony, you mentioned that the department has recovered over $1 billion, which I think is a good start. However, we still have $500 billion in potential fraud out there that we've just identified, and who knows, there might be more. So I'm curious as how many pandemic fraud cases your office has actually referred to the DOJ. Do you know that?
So to give you some background, we've opened over 5,000 cases since March of 2020. We obviously follow the evidence, and once we feel like there's once we feel like there's investigative merit, we take those cases to the Department of Justice, U.S. Attorney's offices, and those U.S. Attorney's offices look at those cases and the prosecutorial merit of those, along with other federal law enforcement entities, because it's not just the Secret Service, but other federal law enforcement entities who are bringing pandemic-related cases as well. So they have to deconflict and prioritize.
So let's stick with that theme, because I'm trying to get some answers. So you have over 5,000 cases. How many of those have you referred to the DOJ?
When we
Give or take.
When we open a case, once we feel like there's enough evidence to move forward from a prosecutorial judicial standpoint, we present that case to the U.S. Attorney's Office. I don't have the breakdown of how many were presented yet. I can get that number back to you, though.
If you could, directionally, do you have an idea?
When we open the case,
Is it a 90% accept rate? Is it a 20%?
Well, accept rate is actually different than presentation rate, because when we open a case, the intent is to eventually present it to the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Right. So I'm trying to make the correlation to you commit a crime, there is a consequence. And what I'm trying to do for the American people to help justify for them their tax dollars being misused on fraudulent basis, and I appreciate and applaud your efforts. I'm trying to connect the dots on what is the number. Directionally, you have no idea. Does the DOJ accept most of the cases? Are most of the cases that you find accepted?
I mentioned in a previous response, so as a federal law enforcement entity, we are, by nature, trying to go after the most egregious actors.
Sure.
That's why we train state and locals at our Computer Forensics Institute down in Alabama to focus on a local level. But we're confident our colleagues at the DOJ, they take as many cases as they can.
So with all due respect, you may be confident, but I don't know if the American people are confident with their tax dollars. And I don't mean any disrespect, but that's why I'm trying to ask these numbers, is to get some answers for the American people. Let me rephrase it. How many of these cases are currently being prosecuted by the DOJ? Do you know that?
I don't know that overall number for the Department of Justice. I do know that we've made over nearly 500 arrests since the beginning of the
Okay, so you've made 500 arrests. What has the result of that been? So I know you've recovered over $1 billion, right? Any jail time?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk to that effect?
I haven't compiled the number of years or months total from the 500 arrests. I haven't done that, ma'am.
Okay, because I do think at the end of the day, just like we treat our children, if there's a consequence to your action, Mr. Dodaro, you talked earlier about deterrence. Well, part of the deterrence process may be actually if we publicly show the American people that we are going after these criminals, these people that are stealing Americans' hard-earned monies, and not only are we recovering the money, but they're doing time and hard time, that might help on the deterrence. So when can I expect some results or a report?
Matt, I'll give you a time frame on that when I get back to the team. But we've been pursuing results since the beginning of the pandemic.
But I'd like an accurate accounting of the results, if at all possible, and just to help on a positive note, saying, listen, we are good stewards of your money. We are trying to get your money back. So with that, I know I'm over time.
Right. The gentlelady's time's expired, but feel free to answer the question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So far, according to the data that we've analyzed from the Department of Justice, there have been over 1,000 people who have pled guilty or have been convicted. There are over 600 charges pending against another 600 people. There have been at least 779 people who've been sentenced so far. This is on page 6 of my testimony, written testimony. The number of people have been, it's gone from 1 year of probation to 17 years in prison. So the sentences are significant. We have a number of individual examples sprinkled throughout our testimony. So that's a broad accounting at this point. Michael probably has even a more precise accounting.
No, I was going to just build on that. There's the numbers, agree with Mr. Dodaro. Everything is on our public website. We post all of the cases that we're, as an Inspector General community, involved in. I couldn't agree with you more. The public needs to know there's consequences. Crime doesn't pay. What we're going to do as Inspectors General, as long as that clock is running, and Congress last year extended it from 5 to 10 years in one group of cases, hopefully we'll do it in others, we're going to keep going. It's going to go for 7 more years or more. But we're going to hold everybody who we can hold accountable. And as Inspectors General, we don't care about dollar thresholds. We're going to go after the smallest dollar to the biggest. Obviously, you prioritize. We have multi-year sentences to date for some people. No one should think they got a get out of jail free card. But one of the things that can help, because we're not only talking about fraud, we're talking about improper payments, right, and recovering money. And so that's where one of the things I mentioned earlier, the Program Fraud Civil Remedies Act, it is a administrative way we can get money back. It's not criminal, but the taxpayers know we're getting the money back. Right now, the threshold to use it is $150,000. We want to raise it to $1 million so that we can go after that.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Crockett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've changed my question a little bit, so I'm going to go to my roots over here. As a criminal defense attorney, a lot of times I would voir dire a jury, and one of the questions that I would ask is it better to convict an innocent person or to let a guilty one go free? And oftentimes, the look that I'm seeing on Mr. Smith's face is the look that I would get from potential jurors, because for them, it was an impossible question. because neither one of them sounded like a good resolution. And I bring this up because what we're talking about is government, which happens to be less than perfect. We are also talking about a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. And so what I want to better understand is I want us to be real. I feel like in this hearing, we've talked a lot as if we can erode all bad guys, make criminals disappear. I believe in the opening remarks from Mr. Dodaro, he talked about the fact that basically there are those that were sitting and ready to pounce, not necessarily that the pandemic was producing some super criminal all of a sudden, but these are fraudsters, many of them who had a record. When you talk about these sentences, one can presume that the higher sentences went with people that most likely had been in trouble at some point in time before in their lives. And so I want to talk about realistically. And I do want to, let me first begin by saying I applaud the efforts that all of you have made in your respective areas to make sure that we are doing our part. But I think that what we're losing sight of is we're losing sight of the fact that we save lives. And there were people that were in desperate need. And when we talk about our economy and the fact that we're still struggling to recover from the pandemic, we minimized some of that. This was a mitigation exercise that Congress had. And so while it may not have been perfect because there wasn't a playbook for the previous pandemic, because I'm guessing most of y'all weren't here 100 years ago, I'm trying to find out, when you look at it overall, if we wanted to be realistic about this imperfect system, what could we realistic, if we were to throw out percentages of fraud or, because I know that right now you don't have a crystal ball to know exactly how much fraud has occurred, but when we look at, say, other programs that have been rolled out, what is a good threshold for what we should anticipate as kind of part of the business that we unfortunately may endure when we're talking about such a large, government is big. And so it's definitely not perfect. There's a lot of people in it. What are we talking about realistically, and how far off of that mark were we when we look at these types of circumstances? And it doesn't matter who answers.
Yeah, Congressman, it's an excellent question, and I don't have any precise number I can tell you. I think for all of us who've done this for a while, the lack of preparedness and the management of the programs at the outset created a much larger opportunity for fraud than should have happened. Whether that should have been, as you noted, there's always going to be fraud in programs where there are some bad people out there who will, no matter how much you try, find their way to get the money illegally. But I think most of us think that number that percentage of fraud could have been much smaller than wherever we're going to end up here, had there been preparedness and action taken in advance.
Okay.
Part of the framework that we work with Congress to put in law back in 2016 requires a fraud risk assessment, a profile, but also a tolerance level for risk that would be set for every individual program. So you would make a conscious decision up front of what you're willing to tolerate in order to have that trade-off for speed and getting delivery of services out there as fast as possible to save lives, to help deal with economic consequences. Right now, it's just whatever happens to us as a government happens to us, and we deal with the consequences. And I've been involved, I've been a GA over 49 years, so we've been a lot of disasters during that period of time. Katrina, and the American Rescue Act during the Great Recession, the $700 billion to unfreeze the credit markets during the global financial crisis. In this situation, there's more fraud than we've seen in equivalent type of things over the years, recognizing that this was the biggest American rescue in history, in our history. But had it been, we've been better prepared and actually implemented the requirements for managing fraud consciously up front, we would have reduced the amount of fraud and made better use of that money to help really achieve the objectives of the legislation.
Thank you.
As I said in my opening remarks, I always think that collaborating, sharing information on the front end will lead to some mitigation of criminal behavior. But obviously, my experience as a law enforcement professional says, there's always going to be some element of criminal activity afoot.
Thank you so much.
Chair now recognize Ms. Boebert for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much to our witnesses who are here today. Appreciate your time and your willingness to be here and speak with us and answer these very important questions. Now, I'm going to get right to it. Members of Congress have been told that American taxpayers were defrauded a possible $560 billion as a result of the federal government's negligence in carrying out these federal COVID relief funding programs. And I'm going to start with a rhetorical question here, but does anyone know of an organization in America or around the world, public or private, that has been scammed out of $560 billion? And simply, is that okay? I certainly can't think of one, and I don't think that it's okay either. So after what was the largest fleecing in American history, possibly world history, can any one of the witnesses today give me the name of one administrator, one director, a supervisor that was fired, demoted, or put on leave because they failed to keep hundreds of billions of dollars from being stolen from the American taxpayers? And I'll yield very quickly to each of our witnesses for a simple yes or no. I'll start with you, Director Smith.
No, ma'am, that's not my focus.
Thank you.
I don't know if as I sit here, I could ask the fellow IGs to see if they know of any actions that have been taken from an administrative side.
Thank you.
Yeah, offhand.
Thank you. I didn't think so. And that's pretty insane. $560 billion we're projecting. And we have hundreds of billions of dollars lost, causing massive inflation. 70% of the money, according to the CEO of LexisNexis Risk Solutions, ended up lining the pockets of crime syndicates in countries like China, Nigeria, Russia, and not a single person in charge of distributing that money has been held accountable. So here's how badly the American taxpayer was conned. The United States federal government has reportedly been defrauded of more money in the last 2 years than the entire 2022 tax revenue of England, Italy, Mexico, Ireland, Greece, Israel, Canada, Poland, and Brazil combined. The American taxpayers have one question: how the heck were these bureaucrats so dang incompetent that they were being scammed out of $35 million every hour for nearly 2 years? Absolutely insane. And what's equally concerning is the fact that for years, Congress has known the size and scope of which the American taxpayer was defrauded, yet this committee refused to act until now that Republicans hold the gavel. And in a desperate attempt to protect the Bidens, the big tech industry, the Democrat Party, the mainstream media has tried to discredit this committee before our work has even begun. There should be nothing more bipartisan than ensuring American tax dollars aren't stolen by fraudsters. But sadly, it's taken a Republican-controlled Oversight and Accountability Committee to be willing to get to work on it. So here we are, the American people had their businesses shut down, they lost their jobs, their livelihoods, their life's work because of government mandates and shutdowns. And that same government spent trillions of dollars, lost hundreds of billions, and the result is skyrocketing inflation and interest rates for the American people. And our role is to ensure that we find out how this happened and make sure that it never happens again and hold those that stole money from the American people accountable. And Chair Horowitz, I would like to ask you, under the Biden administration, we have seen the DOJ wage a full-out attack against the American people, from accusing parents concerned about their children's education of being domestic terrorists, to raiding the homes of pro-life activists, to pressuring private companies to censor conservatives. as Republicans have continued to mention throughout this hearing, there's a clear difference between people who were issued improper payments versus fraudsters who have stolen hundreds of billions of dollars collectively from the American taxpayer with malicious intent. Now, Chair Horowitz, what is the Department of Justice doing to ensure that the federal government is targeting criminals and those who knowingly took millions of dollars from the federal government to fund criminal gangs in Russia, China, and Nigeria?
So we've worked with the department, inspectors general and the PRAC have worked with the Justice Department on these investigative matters. They've set up a fraud task force. We're a member of it with the Secret Service. We've worked closely with law enforcement partners across the federal government. It's going to take a substantial amount of time, effort, and resources because there are so many cases. We have that partnership working right now. We're going to continue to refer cases to them, and they're going to have to make assessments on which cases to bring criminally. We're also working with them on the improper payment side with the civil lawyers as well, because again, we want to get the money back for the taxpayers.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Goldman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for your service and being here today. After that effort to blame the victim for fraud by bad actors, let's first go back to the undisputed premise that the money appropriated by Congress, including by nearly all of my Republican colleagues on the other side during the past two Congresses, was both life-saving and economic saving as we faced the worst pandemic in our history. Now, as a prosecutor, I prosecuted rampant mortgage fraud that resulted from the subprime mortgage crisis, and we know there was significant fraud arising out of the TARP program following the 2008 financial crash. But I was shocked to learn in preparing for this hearing that many of the COVID benefits, or at least some of them, were available based on a self-certification process. Am I correct, Mr. Horowitz, that means that individuals could receive COVID relief funds simply by certifying their eligibility without any independent review?
That's correct.
Now, would you agree, Mr. Horowitz, as also a former federal prosecutor and current IG of DOJ, that a self-certification process is a recipe for fraud?
Absolutely.
I read your opening statement closely, and I appreciate very much your call for more resources for data and data analysis, which, in my experience, is the most effective way of rooting out identity theft, unquestionably the biggest cause of COVID fraud as well as most other frauds. Mr. Horowitz, in your view, has the Department of Justice received enough money to prosecute fraud related to COVID relief funds to the very fullest extent?
I think that's going to be a question over time because they are ramping up dramatically as we are and as Secret Services and others. They will need additional resources, particularly this year and in the coming years, to deal with what I think will be a continued, substantial number of cases.
So you would certainly agree that the department would benefit from more funds for COVID relief fraud?
I believe they will need that this year and then the years to come.
I want to ask you to switch your hats now back to the Inspector General for the Department of Justice. And I'm going to direct your attention to a recent New York Times article entitled "How Barr's Quest to Find Flaws in the Russia Inquiry Unraveled," which is dated January 26, 2023. Did you read this lengthy article last week, Mr. Horowitz?
I did read it.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous consent to introduce this article into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Now, this article is based on a months-long investigation by the Times exposing a tremendous amount of waste and abuse, but no fraud, by Special Counsel John Durham, who was assigned by former AG Bill Barr to investigate the origins of the Russia investigation under a false conspiracy theory. Mr. Horowitz, you released a report on that exact topic, didn't you?
We released our report about the handling of Crossfire Hurricane and the FISA matter in December 2019.
And Crossfire Hurricane, just to be clear, became the Special Counsel Mueller's investigation, right?
It was the what's been referred to colloquially as the Russia investigation.
Right. And you concluded that the initiation of a full Russia investigation by the FBI was legitimate and supported by the evidence. Is that correct?
I would want to go back and find the exact words I used in that report, but we determined we did not find evidence of inappropriate decision-making in that regard. But again, I'd want to use the precise language I used in that report. It is public. It's on our website.
Okay. And you referred one case to Special Counsel Durham, correct?
That's correct. An attorney, Mr. Kleinsmith, who we found had altered a document.
And he pled guilty. And other than that case, do you know how many cases Mr. Durham charged?
As to what's public, I have no idea if there's anything under seal. I'm assuming not, but I don't know the answer to that. There are 2 public cases beyond that.
And how many convictions did he get?
Other than the Kleinsmith case, the other cases were, the juries found the individuals not guilty.
Mr. Horowitz, last night, Congressman Ted Lieu and I sent you a letter requesting that you conduct an investigation into Special Counsel Durham's investigation to see if Mr. Barr or Mr. Durham violated any department policies, regulations, or law. Have you reviewed this letter yet?
I was not aware that you had sent that until you just showed it to me, but I certainly will read it and review it.
Mr. Chair, I'd ask for unanimous consent to offer into the record, and could I just...
Without objection, the gentleman's time's expired.
Mr. Horowitz, can you just commit to right now?
Gentleman's time's expired. We
letter
appreciate the questions on COVID and appreciate the passion for investigations. We'll get to that in the next few weeks, but thank you for the questions. Chair now recognizes Mr. Fry for 5 minutes.
First, Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing today. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. I'm going to highlight an example of COVID fraud in my very own district. Just last year, 2 members of a Myrtle Beach family were sentenced in federal prison and a third to probation for their roles in a scheme to defraud the government out of more than $500,000 through a series of fake tax returns and stealing stimulus checks sent to other Americans under the CARES Act. While many people are struggling to make ends meet during the pandemic, these criminals went on a shopping spree with money stolen from the American people. You know, while I'm a member of Congress, I'm also a resident of that district. This is in my very own community. So I want to thank you, Chairman, for holding this, because this also touches home as it does for many Americans. I would imagine, Mr. Smith, that this is by no means the only place that this is happening. Can you talk about or touch on similar instances that are occurring around the country from a factual standpoint?
Yes, sir. While we talked somewhat about transnational criminal organized groups, our experience in the 5,000 plus criminal investigations that we've opened is overwhelmingly, you know, homegrown actors. You talked about your home district, Myrtle Beach. Our Columbia, South Carolina field office is one of our most active field offices, especially when it comes to employing task force partners. We have they actually won the cyber games that were hosted by the National Computer Forensics Institute last year. So we do have a lot of capacity, a lot of law enforcement passion in your district. But as you mentioned in your question, that is a similar footprint that exists in our other cyber fraud task forces, the 41 other ones around the country. And what we do is employ not just agents with guns, but analysts and other professionals that collaborate together with those financial institutions, with those local banking communities and local law enforcement professionals to detect and arrest bad people.
Thank you. And I know you touched on how you're investigating some of these actions, but can you touch on how you're identifying new cases of fraud or abuse moving forward?
So early in the pandemic, as I mentioned in my opening, we partnered with the Department of Labor, OIG, and SBA OIG, and we signed MOUs, memorandums of understanding, where we shared information, shared anomalies, shared indicators of compromise that lead us to bad actors. I mentioned earlier how we talk to a lot of money mules. We follow money, and once you follow money and what accounts that those resources went into, generally speaking, you're going to get to the bottom of a crime, because overwhelmingly our investigations focus on folks that are looking to enrich themselves through illicit activity. So once you start knocking on doors, asking questions, and looking into bank accounts, you're usually going to get some answers from a law enforcement perspective.
Thank you. Mr. Dodaro, once an improper payment has been made, how difficult is it to recoup that money?
Well, it's important to recognize that the improper payment estimates are estimates and projected. But when they are found, it's always difficult to recover the money. I think in the last 2 years, there have been improper payments of over $200 billion. Recoveries have been about 23 billion.
So 10, 12%-ish?
Yeah.
How would you agree that, I mean, in this instance, would you agree that improper payments are not always recoverable? I mean, you're going to run into a brick wall.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're going to have the same issue with fraud.
Out of all the improper payments that have been made, and I know you've collected $23 billion back, how much can we realistically expect to recover?
That's been about the consistent number that I've seen over time. The main thing I've been trying to do, and convince Congress to have some legislation to do this, and oversight, is to stop the improper payments in the first place. The same with fraud. Unless you prevent this from happening, the prospects of recovering this money over a period of time are pretty slim based on historical evidence.
And I'm going to ask this to you and the director, my final question. Is it possible, from a strategy standpoint, to enlist the help of states, either incentivizing it or whatever, to broaden that perspective? Is that a decent policy initiative to look into?
Absolutely. I've been trying to convince each administration I've worked with to use the state auditors more effectively in that area. Medicaid program in particular. Medicaid program alone in the last 2 years has had $98 billion and $80 billion in improper payments. State auditors could help greatly. State auditors could help in the unemployment insurance area, and auditing. The federal government ought to support state auditors, and they can use them to hold people more accountable for third-party deliveries.
Thank you. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Moskowitz for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And thank you for holding this hearing today on pandemic response, waste, fraud, and abuse. I think we can agree on a bipartisan basis that, of course, we want to find out about waste, fraud, and abuse, because in the emergency management business, one of the things we do after a disaster is we do after-action reviews, and we look at what went right and what went wrong to not repeat those same mistakes. And so, you know, when the country began, you know, we're facing an unprecedented whole-of-country crisis, the first 50-state disaster in American history. Every state had a disaster declaration. At the same time, the Trump administration was ill-prepared, and in fact, several times wanted the states to take the lead instead of the federal government, specifically when it came to PPE. And so we've heard a lot about fraud and abuse today. I want to focus on the waste. It's not as sexy as fraud and abuse, but the amount of waste that happened during the pandemic, especially in the PPE space, is something that I want to discuss. You know, that void that was created when the states had to step up and procure all these resources, the states had to compete against everybody but Antarctica, but most importantly, the federal government. And while the federal government was raising prices, companies were price gouging the federal government, while the federal government was not following their own procurement. In fact, $18 billion was spent by the Trump administration procuring these goods. $10 billion of that did not go through procurement. It was sole-sourced contracts. And so one of the things I want to talk about as the former director of emergency management for the state of Florida for Governor DeSantis is, did the Inspector General's office, and this question is for you, Mr. Horowitz, did the Inspector General's office ever look at anyone within the inner circle at the White House on whether they were involved in specifically selecting vendors and negotiating pricing for PPE?
So each Inspector General has authority by law in the IG Act over the employees in their building, in their agency. We do not have authority to investigate individuals outside, and there is no Inspector General for the Executive Office of the President or the White House.
Okay, I appreciate that. So let's switch over to the GAO then. Has the GAO examined whether anyone within Trump's inner circle, including family members, were involved in decisions on who should get what contracts and the $10 billion that didn't go through procurement and the pricing that was paid for all sorts of different PPE, whether that be masks or ventilators? I mean, trust me, I've read all of the stuff, but I just want to know, did you guys specifically look at any of that?
No, we did not.
Okay. So what if I proffered for you that when states could not get this PPE out of FEMA or out of HHS, that we had to call the White House to get this stuff released directly from his inner circle? What if I proffered for you? Would that sound like normal procurement process during an emergency?
Probably not.
Right. So, one of the questions that I think we should focus on, Mr. Chairman, in this hearing is that COVID was not a 2-year event. It was a 3-year event. And I am more than happy to join with the majority and look at the fraud and abuse that went on in the last 2 years in COVID-related programs. But I think it's only fair for us to also look at the beginning of the disaster and the amount of government waste that existed by the federal government sole sourcing contracts and negotiating pricing within the White House, subverting the process from federal agencies. Because not only did that drive up cost and waste, that filtered down to the other 50 states. Because if the federal government was paying more money and I wanted to buy those supplies, I had to pay more money. So it isn't just the $18 billion that was spent here, it's the money now that FEMA has to reimburse those states for goods that were too expensive because the federal government drove up those prices. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Ms. Luna for 5 minutes.
New at this. I just want to thank the chairman and all of the witnesses for participating. I know it's been a long day, so I'll try to keep this short. COVID improper payments continue to be an area of concern that in the federal government due to lack of oversight from the Biden administration. As Representative Boebert had stated, estimates range as high as $560 billion of government COVID spending was subject to fraud, waste, and abuse. That's our hard-earned taxpayer dollars that could have been used to feed families, heat homes, and fill up the pump during the Biden-caused inflation crisis. President Biden continued to approve COVID spending with no guardrails in place to make sure that the money was going where it was intended to go. We have seen the federal government spending and distributing to illegal immigrants. These same illegal immigrants, mind you, that did not take or pass the health screening process for legal immigrants to come here. And in addition to that, they did not pay into our taxpayer system. I would like to submit the graphic into record. We can see that the city of Chicago is sending $71 million for financial assistance for underserved communities such as undocumented residents. The state of Washington is handing out $340 million in grant payments for immigrants or illegal immigrants who are not otherwise eligible for federal stimulus. And the city of Boston is sending $1 million in direct cash transfers to illegal immigrants who are unable to receive federal COVID benefits. This rewards a dangerous process, incentivizing people to come here illegally, where some have estimated that a shocking 60% of Latin American children who cross the border, largely because they are seeking the American dream and understand some of the benefits people offer in this country, are caught by cartels, exploited for child pornography and drug trafficking. These are not cherry-picked fact or distorted figures. This is actually happening. My question is for Mr. Horowitz. If illegal immigrants are prohibited from federal public benefits, then why are they allowed to receive federal COVID dollars from programs like the American Rescue Plan?
I would have to go back and look at each program and what was how eligibility determinations were made and who was eligible. And I'm happy to follow up with you and provide information to you. We're looking at anybody who's ineligible. Frankly, we don't break it down between the categories as to why. So we're looking for people who are ineligible. We're working with our law enforcement partners on that. Whether you're here legally, not here legally, you really own the business, or you never owned a business, we're going to follow up and pursue that.
Before I yield back my time real quick, I just want to put out there that obviously being a part of oversight, we want to ensure that our taxpayer dollars are being safeguarded, right? But also too that government funds are not being used to largely incentivize and hurt people in the process. And so just to finalize, and maybe just your personal opinion, do you believe that because of this type of inappropriate spending, that it is putting people in harm's way that would potentially not be subject to this victimization?
So, as I said earlier, I don't think we've heard testimony that these programs weren't helpful to individuals. In fact, for many of them, like the PPP program, we've heard from small businesses that it saved them. For restaurants and the restaurant revitalization program, for unemployment insurance, we heard testimony about how it kept people afloat during this period. So we haven't heard testimony that the programs were a waste and useless. What we heard was there was a lack of preparation to issue the benefits. It resulted in fraud, a lot of identity fraud, and what we have heard is from how it victimized not just the public who lost the benefit of these programs to wrongdoers, it harmed the person whose identity was stolen. That individual has to deal with that. And it often harmed the individual who's intended to benefit, because they often struggle to get the benefits because the fraudster got there first.
Thank you.
And programs thought they were the fraudster.
Thank you. And before I leave, Chairman, would you please submit the record for the graphic for record? Thank you.
Without objection. And thank you for your questions. Just to note, they just called floor votes. We're going to get 2 more questioners in, then we'll recess and reconvene 10 minutes after votes. There are only 2 votes, and we move a lot quicker than Pelosi did. So the recess won't take long. But now the chair recognizes Mr. Conley for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. And welcome, Mr. Dodaro, Mr. Horowitz. Welcome back. Ms. Smith, welcome to the committee. My questions are going to be to you, Mr. Dodaro, and you, Mr. Horowitz. On Monday, the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, led by you, Mr. Horowitz, released a fraud alert that found fraudsters used nearly 70,000 questionable Social Security numbers to obtain as much as $5.4 billion from SBA's Paycheck Protection Program. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the fraud could have been stopped if the federal government invested in appropriate data analytics capacity and focused on sharing that data across agency silos and among various levels of government. Is that a fair assessment?
Correct.
Would you agree with that, Mr. Dodaro?
Absolutely.
So, based on previous conversations we've had about improper payments and trying to curb that, which this committee's been talking about for a long time, and has been a high-risk category for GAO for a long time as well, I introduced the Stop Fraud Act that, in fact, would, by statute, do just that. It would have used data analytics and would have propagated data analytics information sharing across federal agencies, a desirable goal that could very well have curbed or prevented the fraud we're concerned about. And the bill would also create a center of excellence to look at best practices and to try to assist other agencies in achieving those goals. Unfortunately, not a single Republican co-sponsored that bill. Today's hearing concern notwithstanding. So I would invite the chairman, Mr. Comer, maybe to take a second look at the Stop Fraud Act, and maybe we can, as he indicated yesterday, his desire and the desirability of cooperating on a bipartisan basis. I do think the Stop Fraud Act has real bipartisan potential, and I would welcome Mr. Comer joining me in that effort. But I do think that there are steps we can take and could have and should have taken that might have made a difference. Mr. Dodaro, would you like to comment on that?
I have, since 2015, recommended the permanent creation of a data analytics capacity to support the IG community. It's had its proven value, and was very disappointed that the Treasury Department did not pick up that option that Congress gave them to take over the Recovery Operations Center, existing capacity. And I was also disappointed that Congress didn't act on my recommendation back in 2015.
Right.
But better late than never. And so I hope that Congress does pass that. I think it will have tremendous proven value and return many more dollars than the investment. But it has to be made permanent so it's ready to go at any time.
Yeah, absolutely. Mr. Horowitz, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I just say ditto at some level, but I'd remind, as you know, and remind Congress, the ROC was created with tens of millions of dollars in taxpayer money. It was very effective. It went away in 2015. We had to start from scratch in 2021 with a new appropriation from Congress and more money. We would have had we not only wouldn't have had to do that, but I bet we would have found some wrongdoing, fraud, and other recoveries in that intervening 5 years between the two disasters, because there were other disaster relief programs.
And I guess the final point I'd pick up on, and you testified to this earlier, Mr. Dodaro, it's the culture too. What's rewarded? You know, what's rewarded is pushing money out the door and funding programs and having metrics that show how many people you've helped and reached, all worthwhile goals. But what's not really rewarded comparably is, and I saved $4 billion. I avoided fraud. I took measures to make sure it couldn't happen. And we have to change that culture. And I'm hoping this piece of legislation is a big step in that direction. But I think your point is very well taken.
Yeah.
And I yield back.
Yeah, and actually, the other culture that has to be corrected, if I may, Mr. Chairman, is to make it clear to agencies, management of the programs, that prevention of fraud is their responsibility. It's not just the auditors coming in later, the investigators, the Secret Service, whoever, because unless it's prevented up front, it's not really going to be totally successful. We'll always need to have investigations afterwards, but unless that culture shifts to the agency management and Congress holds them accountable, you're not going to really be as successful as we all want to be.
Thank you. And before we yield back, I'd like to comment. We're going to hold these agencies accountable. That day starts today. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the Inspector General of the Social Security Administration dated January 31st, 2023. This letter described various activities that that office has undertaken with respect to COVID fraud, notably in relation to the misuse of Social Security numbers, which is an issue at the heart of what you all have discussed today in many COVID fraud schemes. This letter also points out that the Social Security IG has never dedicated funds for oversight. He's never received dedicated funds for oversight. This is another step Democrats could have taken in the American Rescue Plan, but chose not to. So without objection, we'll enter this into the record. Our last questioner before recess, Mr. Fallon from Texas.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, we're hearing a lot of testimony, and would it be fair to say that we're talking about billions of dollars in fraud? Correct. Could be tens, could be hundreds of billions of dollars. The fact of the matter is, I think we're discussing the largest case of fraud in the history of the United States. And frankly, this might be the largest case of fraud in human history, as we've known about these extremes since early 2021. And it's absolutely an embarrassment to this institution, to the executive branch, to all the federal agencies involved. The United States government has been swindled by not only our own people, but criminals in Russia, in China, Romania, and Nigeria, to name a few. It's estimated that 40% of pandemic unemployment assistance funds, about $400 billion in taxpayer money, went to criminal organizations and authoritarian regimes like Russia and China. Just to put this into perspective, according to the World Bank, there are 194 recognized countries on Earth, and 171 of them don't even have annual GDPs that rise to that level of $560 billion. To add insult to injury, Democrats did not hold not one full committee hearing and oversight last Congress on COVID-19 fraud, which begs the question, What is this committee even for? Quite frankly, it's for a hearing just like this, when a potential amount of $500 billion has been stolen. And what did the Democrats do instead of investigating rampant COVID fraud? They used the reconciliation process to ram through $1.9 trillion of spending in the form of the American Rescue Plan Act that continued to fund broken programs we knew were systemically fraudulent. So I ask again, what did the Democrats do for 2 years in oversight instead of investigating the largest fraud in history? Well, they held hearings on the dangers of flea and tick collars for pets, whether or not the Postal Service could handle packages during the holidays, the developments in state cannabis laws, and potential bipartisan reefer reform. They made villains out of CEOs of the critical and essential American energy sector, who are the most effective and most efficient in the world at extracting natural resources. In fact, they help guarantee our national security. So I wonder if Democrats considered if their massive spending and barring federal land leases and permits for drilling had anything to do with the 40-year high in energy prices we've seen. They held hearings on protecting the free speech of environmentalist activists and others that agree with them, while at the same time celebrating censorship of those who didn't share their views. And get this, they hosted 2 depositions, 1 roundtable, and 1 full committee hearing on the Washington Redskins, or Commanders, whatever they're called nowadays. And why? Because somebody had a bee in their bonnet about Daniel Snyder. We had hearings to tell us, believe it or not, that pollution is racist. The weather, racist. Climate change, racist. COVID-19, by definition, an indiscriminate virus, was racist. Maternal health care, you guessed it, racist. And America itself, the land of opportunity and prosperity, where millions of people come to this country every year, both legally and illegally, to live their dream. Many Democrats told us for 2 years that America is systemically and irrevocably racist, that white privilege runs amok. Fortunately, the hard data proves this leftist talking point to be categorically false. And the list of useless hearings goes on and on. Plain and simple, the last 2 years were an egregious dereliction of duty and a waste. So it is, Mr. Chairman, with tremendous delight and relish that I see this committee actually and actively tackling serious matters of import to our country and our citizens. Like, for instance, criminal transnational organized crime stealing $500 billion from the American Treasury and, by extension, the American taxpayers' very pockets. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. We are going to now, without objection, go into recess, and we'll reconvene 10 minutes after the last vote. We only have 2 votes, which won't be long. I know we have about 8 or 9 more questioners and then a second panel. So without objection, we're in recess until 10 minutes after conclusion of the last vote.